The story opens in a future where civilization has already been shattered by a massive war, leaving only one known city still functioning, Chicago. The people who survived came together and rebuilt society inside the city, choosing isolation as their best chance at survival. To keep danger away from the outside world, the founders surrounded Chicago with a huge wall and then divided the population into 5 separate factions, each built around a different human value. The erudite are the thinkers, the people who respect intelligence, research, and logic above everything else. Amity is made up of peaceful farmers who work the land and try to live in harmony. Candor believes truth is the foundation of a fair society, so its people value honesty and justice even when the truth is uncomfortable. Dauntless acts as the city's defense force, trained to protect everyone inside the wall without hesitation. And then there is Abnegation, the faction of selflessness. Its members live plain, simple lives, avoid vanity, and put other people's needs ahead of their own. Because abnegation is so humble and stripped down in the way they live, other factions often look down on them and even see them as poor or weak. But ironically, their selfless nature is exactly why they are trusted with running the government. In this society, anyone who cannot belong to one clear faction is pushed aside and becomes factionless, living without status, safety, or a real place in the system. At the center of the story is Beatrice Pryor, a 16-year-old girl raised in abnegation. Like every teenager her age, she must take an aptitude test that is supposed to reveal which faction best matches her personality. This test is meant to guide her before the choosing ceremony, where she will decide the group she wants to join for the rest of her life. But during Beatrice's test, something strange happens. Her responses do not lead to one clear answer. The woman administering the test, Tori, quickly realizes that Beatrice's mind works in a way the system cannot easily categorize. The results show that she has traits connected to more than one faction. Abnegation, erudite, and dauntless. That makes her divergent, and in this world, being divergent is extremely dangerous. Beatrice is confused and frightened, asking what her actual result is supposed to be. Tori understands the risk immediately. Instead of reporting the truth, she quietly changes the record so it appears that Beatrice tested for abnegation. Then she warns her not to tell anyone what really happened. Beatrice leaves the room with a secret she barely understands, but it is already clear that her life is no longer safe. The entire society is built around one harsh belief. Once a person chooses a faction, loyalty to that faction must come before loyalty to family. Blood ties no longer matter the same way. When the choosing ceremony arrives, Beatrice and her brother Caleb stand with the other teenagers, knowing that one decision will separate them from the lives they have always known. Caleb shocks his family by choosing erudite instead of staying with abnegation. Then Beatrice steps forward for her own choice. Since childhood, she's been drawn to the fearless energy of Dauntless, watching them run, climb, jump, and live with a freedom she never had in abnegation. After a tense moment, she cuts her hand and chooses Dauntless. Her choice breaks her parents' hearts, even though they try to remain composed. Beatrice takes one last look at them before moving away from her old faction and toward her new one. From that moment on, she is expected to leave her family behind and start again. The new Dauntless recruits waste no time. They rush out with the rest of the faction, climbing from the subway system up onto the metal beams above the tracks. A train speeds by, and the initiates are expected to jump into it while it is still moving. Beatrice hesitates for a second, clearly nervous, but then pushes herself forward and lands inside the final train car. There she meets Christina, a confident transfer from Candor, who quickly becomes one of the first people Beatrice connects with. The two girls ride with the others until the group reaches its destination. But instead of calmly walking into their new home, they are forced to jump from the train and land on the rooftop of a building they have never seen before. Waiting for them there is Eric, one of the Dauntless leaders. He wastes no time making it clear that Dauntless does not welcome fear. He points to the edge of the roof and tells the recruits that the entrance to their headquarters is below. The only way in is to jump. The drop looks terrifying. None of the initiates know what is waiting at the bottom. But before fear can spread through the group, Beatrice volunteers to go first. Some of the others laugh and mock her because nobody expects an abnegation girl to be the first one to take such a risk. Still, Beatrice steps forward, takes a breath, and throws herself into the unknown. She falls through the darkness and crashes safely into a net far below. Even though she survives, the fall leaves her shaken. A young, dauntless instructor helps her out and asks for her name. For a moment, Beatrice struggles to answer. Then, realizing this is her chance to become someone new, she gives herself a shorter name, Triss. The others cheer, and with that, Beatrice Pryor begins her new life as Triss. As the rest of the recruits jump down one by one, they are led deeper into the Dauntless compound. The initiates are then divided into two groups, those born into Dauntless and those who transferred from other factions. The Dauntless-born recruits are placed under the supervision of an instructor named Lauren, while Triss, Christina, and the other transfers are assigned to a trainer known as Four. Christina, being naturally blunt, cannot resist making a joke about his name. She asks if 4 is literally just a number, and when he answers calmly, she pushes it further with a sarcastic comment about the numbers before him already being taken. 4 does not get angry, but he makes it clear that in Dauntless, saying every thought out loud may not always be smart. He leads the transfer initiates through the headquarters and introduces them to the pit, the massive open space at the heart of Dauntless life. The place is loud, crowded, and full of movement. People are laughing, fighting, eating, training, climbing, and living with an intensity Triss has never experienced before. For someone raised to stay quiet and invisible, this world feels overwhelming, but also strangely exciting. As Triss follows 4, she notices details about him, including the tattoo on his neck, and her curiosity grows. Everything about Dauntless feels unfamiliar, yet she is clearly fascinated by it. 4 eventually brings the initiates to the area where they will be sleeping for the next 10 weeks. He explains that the space is communal, meaning they will all live together without privacy. Christina immediately reacts when she sees the shared toilets and showers, complaining without filtering herself at all. 4 responds by reminding her that this faction does not hide much. In Dauntless, people live openly, with very little separation between public and private life. For Christina, who came from candor and values directness, the situation is uncomfortable but oddly fitting. Soon after, the recruits change into their new Dauntless uniforms. Then they burn the clothes from their old factions, a symbolic goodbye to the identities they left behind. For Triss, this moment is especially meaningful. The plain gray clothing of abnegation disappears into the flames, and with it, a piece of her former life seems to vanish as well. Afterward, the group heads to the cafeteria, where Triss sits with Christina and meets other transfer initiates, including Will and Al. The conversation quickly turns into a playful debate about the different factions, with each of them pointing out what they admire or dislike about the world they came from. It is one of the first moments where Triss starts feeling like she might actually belong somewhere new, but the relaxed atmosphere does not last long. The sound of metal cups tapping against tables spreads through the cafeteria, and everyone suddenly becomes alert. The noise signals the arrival of the Dauntless leadership. The initiates stand with the rest of the faction as their commander steps forward and addresses them. His words are meant to inspire courage, loyalty, and strength, but for Triss, they also make one thing painfully clear. Choosing Dauntless was only the beginning. Now she has to prove she can survive it. The Dauntless leader tells the new recruits that bravery is not just something they admire from a distance. It is something they must live through their actions every single day. He pushes them to trust their instincts, believe in their own strength, take pride in the faction they have chosen, and understand the responsibility that comes with wearing the Dauntless name. His speech fires up the entire room, and soon the cafeteria explodes with cheers as the older members celebrate the new initiates, lifting them up and welcoming them into the faction's wild, intense world. But the excitement does not last long, because the real training begins almost immediately. The initiation program is divided into 2 major stages. The first part focuses on physical survival: stamina, combat speed, accuracy, and raw toughness. The second stage is designed to break down their minds, forcing them to face the fears they usually try to hide. Together, these stages are meant to turn weak, uncertain recruits into fearless, dauntless members. And from the very beginning, it is clear that this is not a place where everyone gets to stay. The atmosphere quickly becomes competitive, especially because many of the transfers come from factions that do not naturally trust each other. Old attitudes and rivalries follow them into the training room, and some recruits see each other less as teammates and more as obstacles standing in the way of survival. Eric's method of training only makes that tension worse. He is cold, brutal, and completely unforgiving, using fear and humiliation as tools to push the initiates harder. 4, on the other hand, is still strict, but his style feels more controlled. He watches carefully, corrects mistakes, and seems to understand that not every lesson needs to be delivered through cruelty. During one early training session, Eric decides to make an example out of the recruits by pairing the first jumper against the last jumper. Since Triss was the first to leap into the Dauntless compound, she is forced into the ring. She is not ready for the fight at all. Her opponent overwhelms her almost immediately, landing hit after hit, while Triss struggles to defend herself. She tries to keep going, but her body cannot take the punishment for long. Eventually, she collapses and loses consciousness. When she wakes up, the reality of Dauntless becomes even harsher. Eric posts the rankings, and Triss's name is dangerously close to the bottom. The message is obvious. If she does not improve quickly, she will be removed from the program and forced to live factionless. For the first time, the dream of becoming Dauntless feels less like freedom and more like a countdown. Seeing how discouraged she is, her friends try to pull her out of that dark mood. To distract themselves from the pressure of training, the group decides to get tattoos, something that feels almost like a rite of passage in Dauntless culture. At the tattoo parlor, Triss unexpectedly runs into Tori, the woman who administered her aptitude test. Tori immediately recognizes her and quietly questions why she would choose Dauntless, especially knowing the danger surrounding her test results. But Triss makes it clear that she did not choose this faction by accident. She wanted this life, and now she is determined to fight for her place in it. Instead of waiting for the next training session to expose her weaknesses again, Triss starts waking up before everyone else. While the others are still asleep, she sneaks into the training area and practices alone, trying to sharpen her movements and build strength before anyone can judge her. Four notices her effort. During training, he points out where she is vulnerable and teaches her how to use timing and strategy instead of relying only on power. He explains that if she cannot overpower someone, she needs to find the spots where a stronger opponent can still be hurt. Triss listens closely, grateful for the help, but she is also very aware of how close Four is standing beside her. As he corrects her form and shows her where to strike, she cannot help noticing him in a different way. His calm confidence, his sharp focus, and the mystery around him make him difficult for her to ignore. Even in the middle of danger and pressure, there is a quiet tension forming between them. Later, another harsh lesson unfolds when Christina is pushed too far during a sparring match. Her opponent keeps attacking, and Christina eventually gives up. To Eric, surrender is unacceptable. He uses her failure as a public lesson for all the initiates. Christina is taken outside and forced to hang from the edge of a bridge with nothing underneath her except a deadly drop. Her fingers cling to the ledge while water drips from above, making her grip weaker with every passing second. Everyone watches helplessly as Eric times how long she can hold on. Christina's strength begins to fade, and she looks ready to let go. But just before she reaches her limit, Eric orders her to be pulled back up. The point of the punishment is clear. In Dauntless, fear is allowed, pain is expected, but quitting is treated as the worst failure of all. The lesson is burned into every recruit standing there. Dauntless members do not give up, even when their bodies are begging them to stop. After some time, Four takes the initiates outside the main compound for a short tour. As they travel toward the wall, he explains that Chicago may have been quiet for years, but peace can never be trusted completely. The city stays protected because Dauntless remains ready for anything. Beyond the compound, the recruits see the Amity farmlands, wide open fields still carrying scars from the war that destroyed the old world. Christina jokingly suggests that there must be something dangerous or strange beyond the fence, because in her mind, nobody builds a wall like that for no reason. Training continues, and Triss begins showing improvement in unexpected areas. During knife-throwing practice, nearly all of her blades hit the target cleanly, proving that she has better focus and precision than many people expected. Al, however, struggles badly. One of his knives slips out of his hand and falls to the ground. Eric notices immediately and orders the fallen weapons to be picked up. But Al, terrified of accidentally hurting someone or being hurt himself, refuses to follow the command. Eric stays disturbingly calm, but his response is cruel. He orders Al to stand in front of the target without moving. Then he tells Four to throw knives around him, close enough to frighten him but not meant to kill him. If Al flinches, moves, or fails to control his fear, he will be expelled from Dauntless. The room goes silent as everyone realizes how dangerous the punishment is. Triss cannot stand there and watch her friend be tortured by fear. Before the trial begins, she steps forward and volunteers to take Al's place. Her decision shocks the room, but Eric allows it. Triss stands against the target while Four prepares the knives. One by one, the blades fly past her, landing dangerously close. Each throw feels more intense than the last, and Triss forces herself not to move even as fear takes over her entire body. Then one knife cuts too close, slicing near her ear. Blood begins to run down the side of her face. The sight is enough to end the demonstration, and Eric acknowledges her courage by awarding her extra points. To him, the lesson is not about kindness or friendship. It is about control, discipline, and proving that fear can be mastered. Triss is angry at Four afterward, believing he intentionally hurt her. But she later understands that the cut was not meant to punish her. 4 had done it deliberately to end the cruel display before it went any further. By stepping in for Al, Triss earns the admiration of many of the initiates. She has shown courage not just by facing danger, but by protecting someone else from it. For the first time, the others begin to see her as more than the quiet abnegation girl who should not have survived this long. But gaining respect also brings unwanted attention. Among the transfers is Peter, a cruel and arrogant initiate from Candor who seems determined to make Triss feel small. He mocks her constantly, questions whether she deserves her new name, insults her friends, and uses every opportunity to provoke her. Unlike the others, Peter does not see training as a shared struggle. He sees it as a way to dominate everyone weaker than him. Tension inside Dauntless grows even more complicated when G9 Matthews, the powerful leader of Erudite, appears inside the compound. Her presence immediately unsettles Triss. Ever since Torai warned her to hide the truth about being Divergent, Triss has feared that Erudite might be searching for people like her. Seeing G9 so close to Dauntless makes that fear feel much more real. During another combat session, Eric deliberately pairs Triss with Peter, knowing there is already hostility between them. Before the fight begins, 4 quietly gives Triss advice, pointing out Peter's weaknesses and reminding her that strength is not the only way to win. Triss uses that guidance and strikes first, landing a sharp hit to Peter's throat. For a brief moment, it looks like she might actually have the upper hand, but Peter's pride turns the fight ugly. Furious at being embarrassed, he attacks Triss with far more aggression. Blow after blow, he overpowers her, and Triss quickly loses control of the match. She tries to defend herself, but Peter is stronger, angrier, and ruthless. The fight ends with Triss badly beaten once again, collapsing into unconsciousness as the brutal reality of Dauntless closes in around her. As Triss slips in and out of consciousness after the brutal fight, she barely catches a blurred glimpse of 4 walking away from the ring. Then everything fades to black. When she finally wakes up, the situation has become even worse. Because of her low ranking and repeated failures in combat, Triss is now on the edge of being removed from Dauntless completely. But instead of accepting defeat, she refuses to let her new life end this way. When the other initiates leave for their next assignment, Triss forces herself up and runs after the departing train. She is weak, injured, and clearly not in any condition to keep up, but she pushes forward anyway. Her determination catches Eric off guard, and even he seems surprised that she is still fighting for her place. As the train moves, 4 reaches out and helps her climb aboard, giving her the chance to stay with the group. Seeing her refusal to quit, Eric eventually allows her to remain in the faction. The next challenge is very different from hand-to-hand combat. The Dauntless leaders organize a team competition based around capturing a flag. The initiates are split into 2 groups and given special training weapons. These guns do not kill, but their rounds trigger the nerves and create the sensation of a real injury for a short time, making the game painful enough to feel serious. When the team captains begin choosing their players, Eric focuses on brute strength and picks the physically strongest recruits. 4, however, thinks differently. Instead of only choosing the biggest fighters, he selects people who are quick, alert, and motivated. His approach shows that he values strategy just as much as raw power. Once they arrive at the location, Eric takes his team toward the far end of the pier and sets up a defensive position. 4's team gathers together and starts discussing possible tactics. Unlike Eric, 4 actually listens as the initiates share ideas. While the others debate what to do, Triss notices the giant Ferris wheel nearby and realizes it could give them a view of the whole area. Without waiting for permission, she begins climbing it. 4 quickly understands what she is trying to do and follows her up, both to help her and to see the battlefield from above. But as they climb higher, Triss notices something unexpected. 4, who always seems calm and controlled, becomes visibly uncomfortable with the height. His fear starts showing through, even though he tries to hide it. Then the danger becomes real when an old, weakened support beam breaks under Triss's foot. She slips, grabbing desperately for something to hold onto. 4 catches her just in time and pulls her close, stopping her from falling. In that tense moment on the Ferris wheel, Triss realizes that 4 is afraid of heights. She teases him lightly about it, and for once, the serious instructor lets a more playful side show. Their exchange is brief, but it adds a new layer to the connection growing between them. From high above the ground, Triss spots the opposing team's flag near the top of the lighthouse. She quickly comes up with a plan. One part of the team will create a distraction and draw Eric's group away, while 4 deals with their captain and the girls move in to grab the flag. The strategy works. Triss pushes through the chaos, handling confrontations with Peter and Molly along the way, and keeps moving toward the target. In the end, Triss reaches the flag and secures it for her team. She waves it proudly beside her cheering teammates, and the victory feels like a turning point. For the first time, she is not just surviving dauntless training. She is proving that she can think, act, and win in a way others did not expect from her. After the competition, the other Dauntless members begin treating Triss with more warmth and respect. To celebrate the victory, they invite her into a small Dauntless-style initiation tradition. She is strapped into a steel cable system and sent flying high above the city. As she races over Chicago, the rush is overwhelming. The air, speed, height, and lights of the city create a feeling unlike anything she has ever experienced. Triss can barely control her excitement when she finally lands. Four is there waiting for her afterward, and he congratulates her on the win. He praises her courage and acknowledges that she has earned this moment. Having made it through the first stage of initiation, Triss now moves into the next part of training. But the shift also brings new danger, because this stage is not about strength anymore. It is about fear. As the Dauntless later move through the city for their assignments, Triss unexpectedly gets a chance to see her mother, Natalie Pryor. The moment is emotional. Triss is overjoyed and immediately embraces her, relieved to have even a brief connection to her old life. But the meeting quickly becomes serious when Triss tells her mother about the secret she has been carrying since the aptitude test. Natalie confirms what Triss has feared. She really is divergent. Her mother warns her to be extremely careful, especially around the erudite, and hints that the psychological tests can be manipulated if someone knows what they are doing. This makes Triss realize that her mother understands far more about Dauntless, erudite, and divergence than she ever let on. When Triss enters the testing area for the next stage, she sees Molly being led out in a strange condition. Molly looks dazed and disconnected, as if her mind is still trapped inside whatever she just experienced. The sight unsettles Triss, but she has no choice but to continue. Under Four's supervision, Triss enters her own simulation. He tells her that inside the test, she must face her fears and show courage. Once the simulation begins, Triss falls into a trance-like state where the world around her feels completely real. She is forced to confront the things that terrify her most, but as she moves through them, she begins to understand that they are only illusions created by her own mind. When she wakes up, only 3 minutes have passed. Four is visibly confused by how quickly she finished. Most initiates struggle for much longer, but Triss solved the simulation almost instantly. Her ability to recognize the fears as fake and break through them so fast does not look normal. To Four, it is impressive, but it is also suspicious. The other initiates are shaken after their own psychological tests, and Triss's unusually strong performance starts drawing attention. Peter uses the situation to stir doubt, making comments about how quickly Triss is rising in the rankings, and suggesting that maybe something is different about her. He also hints that her influence may have affected others, including Al, making the group's tension even worse. During her second fear simulation, Triss finds herself trapped inside a sealed glass cube that begins filling with water. As the water rises around her, panic starts closing in, but instead of reacting like a normal Dauntless trainee, she studies the situation and finds a way out. With a firm strike against the glass, she breaks the cube apart and escapes the illusion, waking up once again with unusual speed. Four cannot ignore it anymore. His curiosity pushes him to ask Triss again and again what results she received during her aptitude test. He wants to know which faction the test assigned her to. Triss refuses to tell him the truth and keeps insisting that her result was abnegation. But Four clearly senses that something about her does not add up. Later, Tori reveals more about why divergence is so dangerous. She tells Triss that her own brother was also divergent. Like Triss, he was able to get through fear simulations too quickly by using methods the system did not expect. But once people began to notice, he was found dead at the bottom of the chasm. Tori's warning is direct and terrifying. If anyone inside Dauntless discovers what Triss really is, her life will be in danger. This revelation leaves Triss deeply shaken. For the first time, she begins to wonder whether she made a terrible mistake by choosing Dauntless. Feeling trapped and afraid, she goes to see her brother Caleb, hoping he will help her return to abnegation. But Caleb refuses. He has chosen erudite, and he is unwilling to risk helping her. His rejection leaves Triss feeling more alone than ever. As she leaves, Triss runs into G9 Matthews in the stairwell. G9 presents herself with a calm, almost friendly politeness and invites Triss into her office. But beneath that warmth, there is something cold and calculating. During their conversation, G9 subtly brings up the subject of divergence, describing them as dangerous people who threaten the order of society. She also suggests that abnegation may be hiding them. G9's words are carefully chosen. She never openly accuses Triss, but every sentence feels like a test. She tells Triss that if someone close to her were to break the law, she hopes Triss would remain loyal to the system. The meaning is clear enough to make Triss uncomfortable. G9 is watching her, and she may already suspect more than she says. After the meeting, Triss is sent back by G9's driver, but when she returns to the Dauntless compound, the danger becomes immediate. That night she is attacked by 3 masked assailants. They drag her toward the edge near the chasm, trying to throw her over and make her death look like another tragic fall. During the struggle, Triss recognizes one of them. It is Al, her own friend. Before the attackers can finish what they started, 4 appears and fights them off. He saves Triss and stays with her until morning, making sure she is safe. The betrayal hits Triss hard, especially because Al had once seemed gentle and afraid rather than cruel. At lunch the next day, Al approaches her and begs for forgiveness. He is broken with guilt, but Triss cannot accept his apology. What he did was too serious, and she refuses to comfort him after he nearly helped kill her. Soon after, Al's body is recovered from the chasm. His death leaves Triss devastated, and even though she was the victim, she cannot stop blaming herself for what happened. As everything around her becomes more dangerous, Triss begins trusting For more than anyone else. Eventually, she tells him the truth. She is Divergent. Instead of turning her in, For decides to help her. He explains that she must learn to pass the fear simulations like a true Dauntless initiate, not like a Divergent who can simply break the rules of the simulation. Through this training, Triss begins to understand that fear landscapes reveal something deeply personal about each person. The number of fears someone has can even be connected to the name they choose. As For lets her see his own fear landscape, Triss discovers that his name is not random at all. It comes from the 4 fears he carries inside him, and as she watches his final fear unfold, she begins to understand the pain hidden beneath his controlled exterior. As Triss watches For's final fear unfold, the truth about him finally becomes clear. He is not just some mysterious, dauntless instructor with a guarded past. His real name is Tobias Eaton, and he is the son of Marcus Eaton, the powerful leader of abnegation. For years there had been rumors that Marcus had abused his son, but Triss's father had always refused to believe them. Now, after seeing what For carries inside his own fear landscape, Triss realizes those rumors were not lies at all. The calm, controlled man everyone knows as For has spent his life, surviving the damage Marcus left behind. That night, the distance between Triss and For begins to fade. In a quiet, private moment, their conversation becomes softer and more honest than before. Triss asks him about the tattoo hidden beneath his shirt, and For lets her see it. Across his back are the symbols of all 5 factions. As Triss gently traces the marks, she understands what they mean to him. For does not want to be trapped inside one label or reduced to one single quality. He explains that he wants to be more than just dauntless. He wants the courage of Dauntless, the selflessness of abnegation, the intelligence of erudite, the honesty of candor, and the peace of amity. He wants to be a complete person, not a product of a divided system. Then, with a small moment of honesty, he admits that kindness is still something he needs to work on. The vulnerability brings them closer, and For pulls Triss into his arms. They share a passionate kiss, and Triss kisses him back, but she also gently stops things from moving too quickly. She cares about him, but she wants to take it one step at a time. The next day, For shows Triss something deeply disturbing. Erudite members are unloading equipment inside Dauntless territory, which already feels strange because the 2 factions should not be working together so secretly. For then reveals a vial he found among the supplies. Inside is a serum capable of controlling people, turning independent individuals into obedient soldiers. The implication is terrifying. If Erudite can use this on Dauntless, they could create an army that follows commands without question. Soon after, the final initiation test arrives. Torre and For both wish Triss luck before she is placed into the simulation. This test will determine whether she officially becomes Dauntless, but for Triss, the stakes are even higher. She has to pass without exposing that she is Divergent. The simulation begins, and Triss is immediately thrown into a terrifying landscape. Aggressive crows swarm around her, attacking from every direction. Instead of panicking, she grabs a stick near a burning field and fights them off. But the scene shifts quickly, and she finds herself trying to escape flames that spread around her. Before she can get away, she is suddenly tied to a wooden post as the fire creeps closer. The ropes begin to burn, scorching her hands as she struggles to free herself. Once she breaks loose, she rushes toward a nearby swamp and plunges her burned hands into the water to cool them. But the relief lasts only a second. The world changes again, and now she is trapped inside what feels like a glass tank filling with water. Thinking fast, Triss uses her clothing to block the source of the water, stopping herself from drowning. Then the simulation turns more personal. The events of the previous night with Four create a new fear inside her mind. She sees him pushing too hard, trying to control her, and Triss fights back against the feeling of being powerless. She refuses to be dominated or rushed, and by confronting that fear, she finally breaks out of the simulation. When she wakes up, G9 Matthews is there, calmly congratulating her for passing. But the test is not truly over. G9 unexpectedly places a pistol in Triss's hand and orders her to shoot her own parents, who are suddenly standing in front of her inside the simulation. For one awful moment, Triss is forced to face the impossible. Then she pulls the trigger and wakes up for real. With the final test complete, the dauntless leader gives a proud speech congratulating the successful initiates. The new soldiers are arranged into 4 lines, and under orders from their superiors, tracking devices are implanted into them. At first, it looks like a normal part of becoming a full Dauntless member, but Triss quickly notices that something is wrong. Her friends quietly put on their uniforms without speaking. Other Dauntless members stand in perfect silence, almost like empty bodies waiting for instruction. Then one Dauntless member suddenly resists and questions what is happening. Without hesitation, he is shot in the forehead. The moment confirms Triss's worst fear. The serum is not just tracking them, it is controlling them. Triss realizes that the drug does not work on Divergence the same way it works on everyone else. Her mind is still free. But showing that would get her killed instantly. So she forces herself to copy the lifeless behavior of the others, keeping her face blank and moving only when everyone else moves. The Dauntless are armed, organized, and loaded onto the train like an army. On the train, Triss finds Four and carefully tries to see whether he is under the serum's control. When their eyes meet, both of them understand the truth. Four is awake too. A wave of relief passes between them, and they quietly hold hands, knowing they may be the only 2 people in the entire group who still have control over their own minds. The train arrives in Abnegation, and the controlled Dauntless soldiers begin their operation. They storm through the streets, searching every house and dragging Abnegation members into one central location. The peaceful faction is being rounded up by the very soldiers who were supposed to protect the city. Triss and Four head toward her parents' house, but they discover that her family managed to avoid the raid. While moving through the streets, they run into Eric and another Dauntless soldier. Eric immediately notices something off about them. Believing Four should be under the serum like everyone else, he enjoys the idea of finally having power over his old rival. With smug confidence, Eric points a gun at Four's head, ready to kill him. Triss cannot stand by and watch that happen. She raises her weapon and aims at Eric. He mocks her, convinced she does not have the courage to shoot. But Triss proves him wrong. She tells him she is human, not some mindless machine, and shoots him in the leg. The moment exposes them, and Dauntless forces quickly surround Triss and Four. They are taken before G9 Matthews, who explains her twisted reasoning with absolute confidence. In her eyes, Abnegation has become a threat to the faction system and must be controlled. She believes Divergents are dangerous because they cannot be manipulated, and if they are not stopped, they could destroy the order of the world. G9 takes Four away and orders Triss to be executed. But before the executioners can kill her, Natalie Pryor appears and saves her daughter. Triss is stunned to see how capable her mother is, especially when Natalie reveals through her actions that she once belonged to Dauntless herself. Together, mother and daughter try to escape and reach Triss's father and the Abnegation leaders. But during the escape, Natalie is shot. She uses her final moments to protect Triss, sacrificing herself so her daughter can keep moving. Triss is devastated, but she has no time to collapse under the grief. She continues on and eventually finds her brother Caleb with their father, Andrew Pryor. Caleb has finally realized what Erudite is planning and has decided to leave them behind. Triss also sees Marcus Eaton, and after everything she has learned about Four's past, she looks at him with open disgust. When Triss tells her father that Natalie died protecting her, the loss hits him hard. Still, there is no time to mourn properly. The group must stop Erudite before the controlled Dauntless complete the massacre of Abnegation. Triss leads them toward the Dauntless stronghold, and along the way, they capture Peter. He is forced to guide them to the control room where the simulation is being operated. As they approach the command center, Andrew realizes there is no safe way forward. He attacks the guards to give Triss a chance to get inside, but he is badly wounded in the fight. His sacrifice clears the path, and Triss enters the headquarters alone, carrying the weight of both her parents' deaths with her. Inside the control room, G9 is preparing to launch the final stage of the Abnegation Purge. To stop anyone from interfering, she has placed 4 into a special simulation. Unlike the other Dauntless, 4's divergent mind has been forced under control with a stronger method, turning him against the person he loves most. Triss tries to reach him, but 4 attacks her with frightening aggression. The man who had protected her now sees her as an enemy because the simulation has twisted his mind. Triss refuses to kill him, even as he fights her. She realizes that the only way to break through is to reach the real 4 buried beneath the control. She triggers one of his deepest fears by making him believe he is being forced to kill an innocent person. Then when he turns his gun on her, she stops fighting and speaks to him with complete honesty. She tells him that she knows who he is, that she understands him, and that she loves him. Slowly, her words begin to reach him. 4 fights against the simulation, from inside his own mind, until he finally breaks free. Once 4 regains control, he turns against the erudite soldiers in the room. While he handles G9's men, Triss goes after G9 herself. She throws a dagger, pinning G9's hand to the control monitor and forcing her to stay in place. But G9 still refuses to shut down the program. Instead, her system begins moving toward a destructive final mode. Triss sees another way to stop her. She injects G9 with the same mind control serum and uses the program against her. G9, now forced into obedience, is horrified as her entire plan collapses. Under Triss's control, she deletes the program, and the hold over the dauntless soldiers is broken. Across abnegation, the controlled soldiers suddenly wake up, no longer a threat to the innocent people around them. With the massacre stopped, Triss knocks G9 unconscious with one clean strike and escapes with her allies. By the end, Triss, 4, Caleb, Marcus, and Peter are no longer safe anywhere. They have lost their families, their factions, and their place in the system. In the eyes of the city, they are now fugitives and outcasts. The future ahead of them is uncertain, and more battles are almost certainly waiting. But for now, they board the train and ride away together, heading toward whatever waits at the end of the line. When Divergent came out in 2014, it didn't arrive in a quiet little corner of cinema. It walked straight into the middle of that period, where every studio seemed desperate to find the next big young adult franchise. You remember that era, right? Every few months there was another movie about a special teenager, a broken future society, some kind of oppressive system, and a story clearly designed to continue for at least 3 or 4 films. Hollywood had seen how massive the Hunger Games had become, how loyal those book fans were, how easily that audience could turn a dystopian story into a box office event, and suddenly everyone wanted their own version of that success. And that is the first thing you feel with Divergent. Before the story even fully settles in, you can sense the franchise machinery behind it. This is not just trying to be one movie. It is trying to introduce a world, build rules, set up characters, tease future conflicts, and convince you that this is only chapter 1 of something much bigger. That does not automatically make it bad. A lot of good films are built to start franchises, but with Divergent, that intention is very visible. You can almost feel the studio looking at the young adult market and saying, okay, we need our own dystopian saga now. And honestly, that makes the film kind of fascinating to look back on. Because 2014 was a strange year for this kind of thing. Audiences were still very open to young adult adaptations. The appetite was there. The formula was recognizable, but not completely exhausted yet. So when Divergent arrived with its divided society, its teenage heroine, its mysterious identity, and its promise of rebellion, it felt very much like a product of its moment. Lionsgate especially seemed to understand the value of turning stories into brands. They already had major franchise energy around them, and Divergent clearly looked like another piece of that puzzle. It had the built-in book audience, the attractive young cast, the dystopian setting, the romantic tension, the action, the political conflict, basically everything a studio would want if it was trying to build a long-running series. But that also creates the movie's first problem. Instead of feeling like a completely fresh story that just happens to have sequel potential, Divergent sometimes feels like sequel potential came first, and the movie had to carry all that setup on its back. You can feel it in the way the film introduces the factions. You can feel it in the way it explains the rules of the world. You can feel it in the way certain characters are clearly positioned to matter later. There is always this sense that the movie is not only asking, are you enjoying this story? It is also asking, are you ready to invest in this universe? And depending on your mood, that can either be exciting or a little tiring. If you were part of the target audience, especially if you already liked these kinds of stories, then Divergent probably felt like a new world worth entering. It had enough mystery to pull you in, enough romance to keep the emotional side alive, and enough danger to make the whole thing feel bigger than a simple teen drama. But if you were already getting tired of the young adult dystopian wave, then the film probably felt less like a bold new beginning and more like Hollywood repeating a recipe that had already worked somewhere else. That is why the opening context matters so much. Divergent is not just a movie about Triss choosing a faction. It is also a movie shaped by the business environment around it. It came from a time when studios were not just looking for stories, they were looking for sagas. They wanted worlds with rules, symbols, teams, identities, romance, conflict, and enough unanswered questions to keep people coming back. And Divergent has all of that. Whether it uses those ingredients well is a different discussion. But as a franchise starter, you can see exactly what it was trying to do. It wanted to capture that same teenage hunger for identity, rebellion, and belonging that made other young adult adaptations so successful. The interesting thing is, even if the strategy behind it feels obvious, the film still has a hook. There is something instantly clickable about the idea of a society that tells every person who they are allowed to be. That is why, even with all the franchise calculation around it, Divergent still manages to pull some viewers in. It may have been built during a trend, it may have been chasing a market, but it also understood one thing very clearly. Teenagers love stories about being told they do not fit in, and then discovering that not fitting in might be their greatest strength. Now, the biggest problem with Divergent is not that it has a familiar setup. Familiar stories can still work beautifully. We have seen plenty of movies take old ideas and make them feel alive again. The problem is that Divergent often feels like it knows exactly which lane it is driving in, and it rarely tries to swerve. You have the controlled future society. You have the young girl who starts out as someone ordinary. You have a system that says everyone has a fixed place. Then, of course, she finds out she is different in a way the system cannot handle. Suddenly, she is not just another teenager trying to survive. She is a threat. She is the crack in the wall. She is the one person this perfectly organized world is terrified of. And look, that kind of story can be exciting. There is a reason these ideas became popular. They speak to something real, especially for younger audiences. That feeling of being watched, judged, sorted, labeled, pushed into a role before you even know who you are. That is powerful material. But with Divergent, you keep getting this strange feeling that you have already seen the shape of the movie before the movie finishes drawing it. It is hard not to think about the Hunger Games, a future society. Young people placed inside a brutal system, a heroine who becomes more important than she ever expected, a government or ruling class that fears rebellion. The comparison is not exactly hidden. Even if the details are different, the emotional structure feels very close. Then there is the faction system, which immediately brings up that Harry Potter comparison. Not in a magical way, obviously, but in the sense that young people are sorted into groups that define their identity. Except here, instead of being placed into a schoolhouse, your entire life is decided by it. The movie takes that kind of sorting idea and tries to make it darker, more political, more permanent. There are also traces of older dystopian stories, especially the idea of society being divided into fixed classes or roles. That is where comparisons to something like Brave New World come in. People are organized, controlled, and trained to accept a structure that looks peaceful on the outside, but is deeply unnatural underneath. So the film is not short on influences. The issue is that those influences are sometimes too easy to spot, and that is where Divergent starts to struggle. It wants to feel like a bold new world, but a lot of the time it feels like a remix of things that had already worked somewhere else. The movie has its own names, its own rules, its own symbols, but the bones of the story are very familiar. A teenage girl is different. The system fears difference. She trains. She falls for the mysterious guy. She discovers the truth. She pushes back. None of that is automatically bad. But when the movie is over 2 hours long, you need more than a familiar structure with new labels. You need surprises. You need sharper character moments. You need the world to feel so specific that the comparisons start to fade away. And honestly, that does not always happen here. There are moments where Divergent does feel like it has something of its own. The idea of being dangerous because you cannot be categorized is interesting. The fear of not belonging to just one group is a strong theme. The faction ceremony has a nice dramatic weight to it. Even the basic question of what part of yourself would you choose to live by forever is a good hook. But then the movie keeps moving back into familiar young adult territory, training scenes, romantic tension, secret identity. Evil leadership, chosen one energy. It is all delivered with enough seriousness, but not always enough freshness. That is why some viewers see the film as derivative. It does not feel completely empty, but it does feel heavily shaped by the success of other franchises. You can sense it trying to capture that same audience, that same mood, that same feeling of a young heroine standing against a broken system. At the same time, I do not think that makes the movie worthless. This is where the conversation gets a little more interesting, because even though Divergent is not as original as it seems to think it is, it can still be watchable. Some people enjoy the formula. Some people like this exact kind of story. And if the characters work for you, the world pulls you in, and the faction concept clicks, then the lack of originality may not ruin the experience. For me, though, the film's biggest weakness is that it wants the reward of a fresh dystopian world without fully earning that freshness. It borrows the feeling of rebellion, the structure of teen identity drama, and the shape of a franchise origin story, but it does not always push those pieces into something surprising. So Divergent becomes this odd mix. It is not boring because it has no ideas. It has ideas, some good ones actually, but it is predictable because you can feel the formula working underneath almost every scene. And that is the frustrating part. The movie is literally about a girl who refuses to fit into a category, but the film itself fits very neatly into one. So once Divergent moves past that franchise-era feeling, the movie starts laying out its world pretty quickly. We are in a future version of Chicago, not the bright, shiny kind of future where everything looks cleaner and smarter. This is a damaged city, a place that has clearly been through something terrible. There was a war, society collapsed in some way, and now the people who survived are living inside a closed-off system that is supposed to keep everything stable. And the solution this society came up with is, divide everybody into factions. That is the basic foundation of the whole movie. Instead of people choosing ordinary jobs, lifestyles, or communities, they are separated by personality traits. Not small preferences, not interests, not talents exactly, but one main virtue that is supposed to define who they are. There is abnegation, the selfless faction. These are the people who live simply, avoid vanity, help others, and also run the government. Then there is amity, the peaceful and kind group, mostly connected with farming and harmony. Candor is built around honesty, the kind of people who value truth above everything else. Dauntless is bravery, the protectors, the ones running across rooftops, jumping from trains, guarding the city, and basically acting like courage is a full-time profession. And then there is erudite, the intelligent faction, the thinkers, the scientists, the intellectual class. On the surface, it is a very clean setup, almost too clean, honestly, because as a viewer, you understand it immediately. You do not need 10 scenes to explain what these groups represent. The movie gives each faction a clear identity, a clear purpose, and a clear visual impression. You see abnegation and understand restraint. You see dauntless and understand danger. You see erudite and understand control through intelligence. It is simple, which makes it easy to follow. But that simplicity is also where the cracks start showing. Because the more you think about this world, the stranger it becomes. A whole society built around 5 personality types sounds interesting as a story device, but as an actual civilization, it is hard not to question it. Human beings are messy. People are not only brave, or only honest, or only kind. Most people are a mixture of several things, and often those qualities change depending on the situation. So when the movie asks us to accept that almost everyone can live under one label forever, it takes a pretty big leap. Still, the film does get one thing right. The factions create instant pressure. At 16, young people have to choose where they belong. They take a test that suggests which faction fits them best, but the final choice is still theirs, and that choice is permanent. Once they choose, that is their life. Their family, their identity, their place in society, everything can change in one moment. That gives the choosing ceremony real dramatic weight. It is not just a school placement test. It is not just a career decision. It is almost like choosing your entire future in front of everyone you know. And for Triss, that pressure is even heavier because she comes from abnegation, but feels pulled toward dauntless. Then the movie introduces the factionless, and that is where the world becomes darker. If you fail to belong, or if you cannot survive in the faction you chose, you do not just move somewhere else and try again. You become factionless. You are pushed outside the system, treated like a failure, and left to live on the edges of society. The movie does not spend as much time on them as it probably should, but even their presence adds a quiet cruelty to the setup. Because suddenly this world is not just about identity, it is about punishment. The factions are presented as a way to keep peace after disaster, but underneath that peace is fear. Fear of choosing wrong, fear of not fitting in, fear of being rejected by the only social structure that exists. Everyone is told the system creates order, but the cost of that order is huge, and that is what makes the premise of Divergent work, at least in the beginning. The world may not be completely believable, but it is easy to understand emotionally. The idea of being sorted, judged, and forced to define yourself before you are ready is something a lot of people can connect with. Especially teenagers, maybe especially teenagers. The movie is basically asking, what if society did not just pressure you to choose who you are? What if it made that choice permanent? That is a strong hook. And when Triss enters the story, that hook becomes personal. She is not just living in this system. She is about to be tested by it, labeled by it, and possibly destroyed by it. So even if the world building has problems, the basic setup gives the movie enough fuel to move forward. The thing that makes Divergent immediately easy to sell is the faction system. Even before you care about Triss, even before the conspiracy starts, even before the romance or the training or the action, the movie has one idea that is instantly understandable. What if society forced every person to live under one defining trait? That is a very clickable concept. Honestly, it is probably the reason the story caught on in the first place. Because the second you hear about the factions, your brain starts playing the game. Would I be dauntless? Would I be erudite? Could I survive in abnegation? Would candor be unbearable? Would amity actually be peaceful, or would it get annoying after 3 days? The movie does not even have to ask the question directly. The structure naturally invites you to place yourself somewhere inside it, and that is smart. That is the kind of world building that works well for a young adult franchise, because it gives the audience an identity system. It is not just a fictional society anymore. It becomes something viewers can talk about, compare, and argue over. You are not only watching Triss choose a faction, you are quietly wondering what choice you would make. That is where Divergent has one of its strongest hooks. The factions are simple, maybe too simple, but they are memorable. Abnegation means selflessness. Dauntless means bravery. Erudite means intelligence. Candor means honesty. Amity means peace and kindness. You do not need a complicated explanation to understand what each group represents. The movie gives you the basic emotional language right away, and in a story like this, that matters. A fictional world can be deep, but if the audience cannot understand the rules quickly, they will disconnect. Divergent does not have that problem at the start. Its world is built around clear labels, clear values, and clear social pressure. You understand the choice. You understand the fear. You understand why Triss is nervous. But the same thing that makes the faction system easy to understand also makes it easy to criticize. Because once you stop playing the "which faction would I choose" game, the whole setup starts to look shaky. Human beings are not that clean. Nobody is only brave. Nobody is only honest. Nobody is only kind. Even the most selfless person can be selfish sometimes. Even the smartest person can be emotional or irrational. Even the bravest person can be afraid. So the faction system works better as a metaphor than as a believable society. As a metaphor, it is actually pretty effective. It captures the pressure of being labeled. It turns personality into destiny. It takes that teenage fear of being reduced to one thing and makes it physical, political, permanent. In real life, people do this all the time, just in smaller ways. They decide you are the quiet one, the smart one, the troublemaker, the nice one, the weak one, the brave one. And once that label sticks, it can be hard to escape it. Divergent just exaggerates that feeling into a whole civilization. That is why the idea still works, even when the logic does not. You may not believe that an entire city could function this way, but you understand what the story is trying to express. The world is saying, choose one version of yourself and live there forever. And Triss becomes interesting because she cannot do that. She is not built for one box. The faction system also gives the movie a clean source of conflict. If everyone has a place, then the person who does not fit becomes dangerous, not because she is violent, not because she wants power, but because her existence proves the system is lying. That is a strong idea. The movie does not always explore it as deeply as it could, but the foundation is there. Divergents are feared because they expose the weakness of the entire structure. If one person can belong to more than one faction, then maybe everyone is more complicated than the system allows. And if that is true, then the whole society is built on a false idea. That is what makes the faction system more than just a gimmick. At its best, it is not only about sorting people into cool groups, it is about control. It is about making people easier to manage by convincing them they are simple. If you can convince someone they are only one thing, you can predict them, you can use them, you can keep them in their lane. And that is exactly why Triss becomes a problem. Still, the movie sometimes gets distracted from the most interesting part of its own concept. Instead of digging deeper into how each faction thinks, how they live, how they justify the system, and how people emotionally suffer under those labels, the film often uses the factions as background for training, romance, and action. That is not always bad. The movie needs movement. It cannot just sit around explaining political theory for 2 hours, but you do feel the missed potential. The faction system is fascinating enough that you want more from it. You want to understand the everyday life. You want to see more tension between the groups. You want to know how people really feel about being locked into one identity forever, because the idea is strong. Maybe stronger than the movie around it. And that is the strange thing about Divergent. Even when the film is being predictable, even when the world building raises obvious questions, the faction system keeps pulling you back in. It gives the movie an identity. It gives the audience something to hold on to. It gives Triss' personal journey a clear shape. So yes, the faction system is unrealistic. Yes, it is simplified. Yes, it probably falls apart if you think about it for too long. But as a hook, it works. It makes the world instantly readable. It makes the central conflict personal. And most importantly, it turns a very ordinary fear, the fear of being told who you are, into the foundation of an entire dystopian society. And this is where Divergent starts running into trouble. The faction system is a great hook. It is easy to understand, easy to market, easy to remember. But the moment you begin treating it like a real society instead of a symbolic idea, the whole thing becomes a little harder to buy. Because let's be honest, this world asks for a lot of patience from the viewer. We are told that after some kind of devastating war, the survivors in Chicago created this new social structure to preserve peace. Fine. That part is not impossible to accept. Societies do rebuild themselves after disasters. People do create rules, systems, and hierarchies when they are afraid of chaos returning. But then the movie says the solution was to divide everyone into 5 personality-based groups and make that the foundation of civilization. That is where you pause for a second, because who decided this? How did everyone agree to it? Was there no argument at the beginning, no resistance, no group of people saying, actually, maybe organizing human life around 5 personality traits is a terrible idea? The film does not really give us that history. It just drops us into the system after it has already become normal. And that can work if the world feels strong enough on its own. Sometimes a movie does not need to explain everything. But with Divergent, the questions keep stacking up because the system is so extreme. For example, why only these 5 factions? Selflessness, bravery, intelligence, honesty, and kindness are obviously important qualities. But are they really the only qualities worth building a society around? What about creativity? What about patience? What about leadership? What about curiosity? What about loyalty? What about people who are practical, technical, spiritual, artistic, or just good at doing everyday work? The movie gives us 5 clean labels, but a real society is not clean like that. And then you start thinking about professions. Amity grows food, Dauntless protects the city, abnegation governs, erudite handles knowledge and science, candor seems connected to truth and justice. Okay, but where are the doctors? Where are the artists? Where are the engineers? Who is building things? Who is repairing the city? Who is designing technology? Who is teaching children? Who is making medicine? Who is doing all the boring but necessary work that keeps a civilization alive? Maybe the book answers some of this. Maybe there are details that did not make it into the movie. But judging the film by itself, the world feels underexplained. And that is a problem because the story depends on us believing in this society enough to fear it. A dystopian world does not have to be realistic in every small detail, but it does have to feel internally convincing. You need to believe that people inside that world would accept it, or at least understand why they are trapped in it. With Divergent, the structure often feels more like an idea for a young adult personality quiz than an actual civilization. That sounds harsh, but it is exactly the issue. The factions are emotionally clear, but practically confusing. Even the idea of divergence raises questions. The movie treats divergence as rare because they show strength in more than one area. But would that really be rare? Most people are mixed. A brave person can also be intelligent. A kind person can also be honest. A selfless person can also be bold. In fact, the idea that only a few people contain more than one trait almost makes the rest of society seem strangely artificial. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the system is supposed to feel unnatural. But the film does not always frame it that way with enough sharpness. It wants the faction system to be both a cool world-building device and a dangerous social lie. The problem is, sometimes it leans so hard into the device that the lie becomes obvious too early. So instead of slowly discovering that the system is broken, we are kind of sitting there from the beginning thinking, well, of course this does not work. That weakens the mystery. It also weakens the threat a little. If the society feels impossible from the start, then the villains are not protecting a believable order. They are protecting a system that already looks ridiculous to us. And when a dystopian movie wants to scare you with control, the control has to feel disturbingly plausible. You should be able to understand how people got trapped inside it. Here, the movie does not always give us that bridge. We know there was war. We know the city is damaged. We know factions exist to prevent conflict, but we do not really feel the historical trauma that made people accept this arrangement. We do not see enough of the fear that created it. We do not get enough daily life detail to understand why ordinary people still believe in it. That is why the world sometimes feels thin. It has rules, but not enough roots. And that matters because Divergent has genuinely interesting ideas underneath all this. A society that tries to erase complexity could be fascinating. A government that fears independent thought could be frightening. A culture where people willingly reduce themselves to one identity could be very disturbing, but the movie often stops at the surface. It tells us the system exists, shows us the ceremony, shows us the factions, and then quickly moves into tryst training. The larger world remains more of a backdrop than a fully developed place. To be fair, not every viewer will care about this. Some people can accept the premise, enjoy the characters, and move on. And honestly, if you watch Divergent purely as a YA adventure, the world-building issues may not ruin the experience. The movie is clear enough to follow, and the emotional metaphor is strong enough to understand. But if you are the kind of viewer who starts asking practical questions, the film gives you plenty of reasons to get distracted. The faction system works as a symbol. It works as a teen identity metaphor. It works as a clean narrative engine, but as a society, it is shaky, and that is the frustrating part. The movie has a world that is interesting enough to make you curious, but not developed enough to satisfy that curiosity. It opens the door to big questions, then walks past many of them because it is more interested in training, romance, and franchise setup. So the issue is not that Divergent has a strange world. Strange worlds can be amazing. The issue is that this strange world does not always feel thought through. It gives us the shape of a dystopia, but not always the weight of one. One of the darker ideas in Divergent is also one of the most underused, the factionless. Because once you understand how this society works, the factionless are not just background people. They are not just poor citizens standing around to make the world look harsher. They are proof that the system is already cruel long before the big conspiracy even begins. The movie tells us that if you do not belong to a faction, or if you fail after choosing one, you become factionless. That sounds simple at first, almost like a warning built into the rules. Pick carefully, train hard, do not fail. But when you actually think about it, that is horrifying. This society claims to be organized around peace, order, and stability after a devastating war. It presents the factions as a solution, almost like this is the only way people can live together without destroying each other again. But then, right underneath that clean structure, there is an entire class of people who have been pushed out of the system completely, and nobody seems nearly disturbed enough by that. That is what makes the factionless so interesting. Their existence exposes the lie of this world. The factions are supposed to create belonging, but they also create exclusion. They are supposed to give people identity, but they also punish anyone who cannot survive inside that identity. They are supposed to prevent chaos, but they produce suffering and then pretend that suffering is just the fault of the people who failed. That is a much more uncomfortable idea than the movie fully explores. For Triss, the threat of becoming factionless is very real during her dauntless training. It is not just embarrassment. It is not just losing a competition. If she falls too low in the rankings, her entire future disappears. She does not get to go home and start over. She does not get to choose again. She gets thrown outside society. That gives the training a sharper edge. Every fight, every test, every ranking is not only about proving bravery. It is about avoiding social death. And honestly, that part of the movie could have hit much harder if the film spent more time showing what factionless life really means. We see enough to understand that they are treated badly, but not enough to feel the full weight of it. They are present as a warning, but they are not explored deeply as people. That feels like a missed opportunity, because the factionless could have made the whole world of Divergent feel more real. They could have shown us the cost of the system in human terms, not through speeches, not through exposition, but through ordinary lives ruined by one failed choice, people who were not brave enough for dauntless, people who could not live selflessly enough for abnegation, people who did not fit cleanly into any faction, but were not considered special enough to be feared as divergent. That last part is important. Because the movie treats divergents as dangerous because they do not fit, but the factionless also do not fit. The difference is that divergents are hunted because they might threaten the system, while the factionless are ignored because the system has already crushed them. That contrast is fascinating. One group is feared because their difference has power. The other group is abandoned because their difference has been turned into failure. In both cases, the message is the same. If you do not fit the category society gives you, you are not safe. And that makes the faction system feel less like a personality structure and more like a class system. it is not just about who you are. It is about where you are allowed to stand. The people inside the factions have purpose, food, work, status, and protection. The factionless have almost nothing. They exist at the bottom of a world that pretends everyone has a place. That is the cruel irony. This society is obsessed with belonging, but it has no mercy for people who do not belong. The film could have used the factionless to deepen its political side. Instead of only focusing on Erudite as the obvious villain, it could have shown that the entire system is already violent in quieter ways. You do not need a coup to see the cruelty. You do not need soldiers marching through the streets. The cruelty is already there in the rule that says one failure can remove you from society. That is dystopian in a very real way, not because it is loud or dramatic, but because it feels bureaucratic, cold, normalized. People accept it, they grow up knowing the risk. They repeat phrases like faction before blood and act as if this is just how life works. That kind of cruelty is often scarier than open villainy because it does not look like madness to the people living inside it. It looks like order, and that is where Divergent has something stronger than it sometimes realizes. The factionless are the shadow of every choice in the film. When Triss chooses Dauntless, we are not only watching a girl chase bravery. We are watching someone gamble her entire existence. If she cannot become what Dauntless demands, she loses everything. That makes her situation more tense, but it also makes the world more tragic. Because not everyone can win that gamble. Not everyone is Triss. Not everyone has hidden Divergent ability. Some people fail. Some people fall. Some people are pushed out and forgotten. And the system keeps going, still calling itself peaceful. That is why the factionless matter. They are not just a detail. They are the evidence. They show that the faction system does not only classify people, it disposes of them. And if Divergent had spent more time with that idea, the movie's world could have felt much more powerful. The rebellion would not only be about Triss surviving or Divergence being hunted. It would also be about every person damaged by a society that only values people when they fit neatly into its design. The film gives us that idea, but mostly in the background. Still, even as background, it works. The factionless add a quiet bitterness to the story. They remind us that beneath the ceremonies, the faction colors, the tests, and the clean language of virtue, this world is built on exclusion, and that makes the system look much less noble. Because a society that creates belonging by abandoning everyone who fails was never truly peaceful. It was only organized. One thing Divergent does get right, even when the world building itself feels shaky, is the look of future Chicago. The movie has problems, yes, plenty of them, but visually there are moments where you can understand exactly what kind of ruined world it wants to create. This is not a future city filled with glowing towers, flying cars, and shiny technology everywhere. It is more broken than that, more abandoned. More like a place that used to be powerful, used to be alive, and then something terrible happened long enough ago that nature started quietly taking it back. That image works. There is something interesting about seeing Chicago not as a futuristic paradise, but as a wounded city. Buildings are still standing, but they look tired. The streets still exist, but they do not feel fully alive. Huge sections of the city have this overgrown, half-forgotten quality, almost like the human world lost control, and the natural world started creeping in through the cracks. And honestly, those details do more for the movie than some of the exposition. Because when you see the damaged skyline, the empty spaces, the decaying structures, you get a feeling of history. The film does not explain the war in much depth, and it does not answer every question about what happened before the factions. But visually, the city gives you at least some sense that this society was built on top of collapse. The drained Lake Michigan is probably one of the more memorable touches. It is one of those background details that makes the world feel strange without needing a character to stop and explain it. You look at it and immediately understand that this is not the Chicago we know. Something massive changed here. Something environmental, political, maybe catastrophic. The movie does not dig into it much, but as an image, it has weight. And that is where Divergent is at its strongest visually. Not in the clean faction rooms, not in the costumes, not even always in the action scenes, but in the wider view of the city itself. The ruined Chicago setting gives the film scale. It makes Triss' world feel bigger than her training class, bigger than Dauntless, bigger than the politics between abnegation and erudite. There is a whole damaged civilization around these characters, and even if the script does not fully explore it, the city keeps reminding you that this story is taking place after something huge. There is also a nice contrast between the rigid social system and the messy physical world around it. The factions are all about order, labels, categories, rules, people being placed exactly where the system wants them. But the city itself does not look orderly. It looks cracked, overgrown, unstable. That contrast is actually more interesting than the movie sometimes realizes. The people are trying to build a perfect structure inside a broken place. That says a lot. Now, does the movie always take full advantage of that setting? Not really. There are times when the environment feels more like a backdrop than a living part of the story. You want to spend more time in this ruined Chicago. You want to see how each faction occupies it differently. You want to know what daily life looks like in these damaged spaces. You want the city to feel less like a cool location and more like a character with its own history. But even with that limitation, the city gives the film atmosphere. The dauntless scenes especially benefit from the urban setting. The trains that never really seem to stop, the rooftop jumps, the climbing, the running through industrial spaces, all of that fits the idea of a faction that treats danger like a lifestyle. Sometimes it looks a little ridiculous, sure, but visually it gives dauntless energy. They feel connected to the physical structure of the city, almost like they are using the ruins as their playground, their training ground, and their identity. That part is fun to watch. There is a roughness to it that helps the movie feel more alive. Even when the training becomes repetitive, the setting gives the scene some movement. The characters are not just standing in rooms talking about bravery. They are throwing themselves through the remains of a city that already looks dangerous before anyone starts fighting. Still, the overall visual design is not perfect. Some parts of the world are much more memorable than others. The broken city has personality, but not every interior space does. Some faction areas feel a little too plain, a little too safe, almost like the movie wanted to suggest a dystopian future without fully committing to a bold visual identity. That is why the production design creates mixed feelings. From a distance, Divergent can look impressive. The large shots of Chicago, the damaged buildings, the sense of urban decay, those are strong. But up close, the world can feel less imaginative. The movie gives you enough visual detail to believe there was destruction, but not always enough to believe this society has been shaped by decades of living inside that destruction. And yet I would still say the future Chicago setting is one of the better parts of the film. It gives Divergent something physical to hold onto. Even when the faction logic feels questionable, even when the story starts feeling familiar, the city helps create mood. It tells you without too much effort that this is a world built after failure, a world where people are trying to control human nature because they are terrified of returning to chaos. That is a good visual foundation. The film may not always build enough on top of it, but the foundation itself works. The overgrown streets, the damaged skyline, the drained lake, the rough industrial spaces, they all create a version of Chicago that feels wounded, strange, and just believable enough to keep your imagination engaged. And in a movie where so many ideas are explained through labels, tests, and faction rules, it is refreshing when the visuals are allowed to speak for themselves. Future Chicago is not the deepest dystopian world ever put on screen, but it has a texture, it has a mood. It has enough broken beauty to make you wish the movie had trusted that atmosphere even more. This is where Divergent becomes a little frustrating visually, because the movie has a concept that should be perfect for strong design. Think about it, you have 5 factions, each built around a different value: selflessness, bravery, intelligence, honesty, peace. That should give the film so much room to play with costume, architecture, color, behavior, even the way people move through spaces. And to be fair, the movie does try. Abnegation has that plain, gray, modest look. Everything about them is meant to feel quiet and stripped down. No vanity, no flash, no unnecessary beauty. Dauntless is darker, rougher, more physical. Erudite looks cleaner and sharper, clearly meant to suggest intelligence, power, and cold control. Amity has a softer, warmer feeling. Candor has its own formal, honesty-based identity. So yes, you can tell the groups apart. But that is also the issue. You can tell them apart, but you do not always feel them. The faction designs are readable, but not especially bold. They communicate the basic idea, but they rarely surprise you. Abnegation looks plain because they are selfless. Dauntless looks edgy because they are brave. Erudite looks polished because they are intellectual. It is all very direct, maybe too direct. There is nothing wrong with simple design, especially in a movie that already has a lot of world rules to explain. But when the entire society is built around identity, you want that identity to feel more lived in. You want each faction to look like it has history, rituals, habits, contradictions, not just a color palette and a personality label. That is where Divergent falls short compared to what it could have been. A faction-based society should feel visually rich. The clothes should tell us how these people think. The spaces should tell us what they value. The smallest details should make you understand why someone would feel proud to belong there or terrified to leave. Instead, the movie often settles for broad visual shorthand. And sometimes that shorthand feels almost too safe. Take Erudite, for example. This faction is supposed to represent intelligence, ambition, and eventually a kind of cold authoritarian power. G9, played by Kate Winslet, should visually feel like someone who has turned intellect into control, but her look is surprisingly ordinary. She often comes across less like the face of a terrifying dystopian power structure and more like a corporate executive walking into a board meeting. That can work in its own way, I guess. There is something believable about power looking clean, calm, and professional. Not every villain needs a dramatic costume, but in a world that is already asking us to believe in big symbolic divisions, G9's visual identity could have been sharper. More memorable, more unsettling. The same goes for the faction environments. Some of them make sense, but they do not always leave a strong impression. The movie gives us enough to understand the system, but not enough to make each faction feel like a complete culture. You can describe the factions easily after watching the film, but can you really feel the difference between them in a deep visual way? Not always. That is why the ruined Chicago setting often feels more interesting than the designed society inside it. The broken city has texture, it has decay, it has mood. The faction spaces, by comparison, can feel a little too clean or too basic. There are moments where the outside world looks like it belongs to a post-war dystopia, while the faction design feels more like a simple visual guide for the audience. And again, that is not disastrous. The movie still looks polished. It does not look cheap in every scene. There are strong images, especially in the wider city shots and some of the dauntless material. But the art direction does not always push the premise as far as it could. When people compare Divergent to the Hunger Games, this is one area where the difference becomes noticeable. The Hunger Games had a much stronger sense of visual exaggeration. The costumes, the capital, the contrast between wealth and poverty, whether you liked it or not, that world had a bolder visual identity. It was strange, colorful, ugly, glamorous, and disturbing all at once. Divergent is more restrained. Sometimes that restraint helps. It makes the world feel less cartoonish, but sometimes it also makes the film feel less imaginative. A future society divided into personality-based factions should not feel visually ordinary. It should feel like every part of life has been shaped by that system. Clothes, buildings, ceremonies, gestures, social spaces, everything should carry the weight of the ideology. Here, the ideology is clear, but the visual culture feels thin. Dauntless probably comes closest to working because their identity is physical. They jump from trains, climb structures, fight each other, and turn the city into a giant obstacle course. Their visual world is more active, so it naturally feels more alive. You understand them not just by what they wear, but by what they do. Abnegation also works in a basic way because their plainness is the point. Their lack of visual expression becomes their expression. But even there, the movie does not dig too deeply into what it feels like to live in that kind of self-erasing culture. The other factions remain less developed. You know what they stand for, but you do not spend enough time inside them to feel their identities beyond the label. That is the missed opportunity, because this movie could have used art direction to answer some of the world-building questions the script leaves open. Instead of explaining everything through dialogue, the film could have shown us how these factions shaped daily life. How people eat, how they work, how they decorate or refuse to decorate, how children are raised, how public spaces reflect values, how power looks different in each group. Those details would have made the world feel more real. Instead, Divergent often gives us a functional design rather than an unforgettable one. It does the job, but it rarely goes beyond the job. It tells us who belongs where, but it does not always make us feel the emotional weight of belonging there. And that matters because identity is the whole movie. If the story is about people being forced into categories, then those categories should feel overwhelming. They should feel seductive and frightening at the same time. You should understand why someone might want to belong to a faction, but also why that belonging slowly becomes a cage. The costumes and faction designs hint at that idea, but they do not fully capture it. So visually, Divergent is not a failure. It has polish, it has clarity, it has some good atmosphere, but it also feels like a film that could have looked far more distinctive if it had trusted the strangeness of its own premise. The factions are easy to recognize, they just are not always easy to remember. Now, for all the problems people have with Divergent, the movie does have one thing that keeps it from completely falling apart: Triss. Because if Triss does not work, this whole movie is basically dead on arrival. The world can be interesting, the factions can be clever, the action can be decent, but the entire story is built around one girl trying to understand who she is while everyone around her keeps telling her what she is supposed to be. If we do not care about that, then the faction system is just decoration. And honestly, Shailene Woodley does a lot of heavy lifting here. Triss begins the story as Beatrice Pryor, a girl raised in abnegation, surrounded by selflessness, modesty, quiet service and emotional restraint. She is not introduced as some obvious action hero. She is not walking into the movie with swagger. She is not instantly rebellious in a loud, dramatic way. She is unsure. She is curious. She feels slightly out of place, but not in a way that makes her seem fake or overly special. That is important, because a lot of these young adult stories fall into the trap of telling us the heroine is ordinary while filming her like the most important person in the universe from the first scene. Divergent does some of that too, sure, but Woodley gives Triss enough awkwardness and hesitation to make her feel a little more grounded. You can believe she has grown up in a world where wanting more than your assigned place feels almost shameful. There is something very quiet about her at the start. She watches Dauntless with fascination, but she is not fully dauntless yet. She loves her family, but she does not completely belong in abnegation either. She is stuck in that uncomfortable space where staying feels dishonest, but leaving feels like betrayal. That conflict gives her early scenes some emotional weight. When she chooses Dauntless, it is not just a cool, rebellious moment. It is a break from her family, her upbringing, and the version of herself everyone expects her to become. The choice has consequences. She is not simply choosing a faction. She is choosing uncertainty. And that makes her more interesting than if she were just chasing adventure. What works about Triss is that she is brave, but not instantly strong. There is a difference. The movie does not present her as someone who enters Dauntless and immediately dominates everyone. She struggles, she loses, she gets hurt, she doubts herself. At times, she looks completely out of her depth, and that makes her progression easier to invest in. You are not watching a superhero pretending to train. You are watching a scared young woman trying to survive a world that is rougher than she expected. And Woodley plays those moments well. She has this natural vulnerability that fits Triss perfectly. She can look frightened without seeming weak. She can look determined without seeming invincible. That balance matters because Triss is supposed to be someone who contains different qualities at once. She is not only brave, she is not only selfless, she is not only intelligent. She is messy, conflicted, and still forming. That is what makes her a good center for this story. Her divergence is not just a plot twist. It matches the way she feels as a character. She does not fit neatly in one place because emotionally, she never has. Abnegation shaped her, but it did not fully define her. Dauntless attracts her, but it does not completely explain her either. She is somewhere between fear and courage, family loyalty and independence, obedience and resistance. That inner conflict is more compelling than some of the bigger political material around her. The movie is at its best when it stays close to Triss' experience. Her anxiety before the choosing ceremony, her panic during training, her fear of being discovered, her attempt to appear normal when the one thing she cannot be is normal. These are the scenes where the story feels personal instead of just mechanical, and that is probably why many viewers respond to her. Triss is not the most original YA heroine ever written. She follows a familiar path. Ordinary girl, hidden identity, dangerous system, romantic mentor, rebellion. We have seen versions of this before, but Woodley makes her sympathetic enough that the familiarity does not completely ruin it. She gives the role a certain sincerity. You feel like Triss is trying, not performing heroism for the camera. There is also something relatable in how uncomfortable she is with being watched and judged. Dauntless is a faction built on public performance. Everyone is ranked, everyone is tested, everyone is measured. For someone like Triss, who has spent her life learning to disappear into selflessness, that is terrifying. Suddenly, she has to fight in front of people, fail in front of people, and prove herself in a culture that does not have much patience for weakness. That transition is one of the better parts of the film. Because Triss is not just changing factions, she is changing the way she exists in the world. In Abnegation, she was taught not to take up space. In Dauntless, she has to fight for space. That is a strong character journey, even if the movie sometimes handles it through familiar training scenes. Her vulnerability also makes the action more effective. When she is thrown into fights or tests, you do not feel like victory is guaranteed in every moment. Of course, we know she is the lead, so the story is not going to discard her early, but emotionally, she sells the danger. She looks like someone who can be hurt. She looks like someone who is still learning where her strength comes from. That is much more engaging than a character who is perfect from the beginning. At the same time, the movie occasionally pushes Triss toward the usual chosen one territory. The more the plot reveals how important divergents are, the more she becomes the special person the system fears. That is expected for this kind of story, but it is also less interesting than the earlier version of her. The girl who simply does not know where she belongs. The smaller Triss is more compelling than the mythic Triss. When the movie lets her be confused, flawed, and scared, she feels real. When it starts framing her as the key to everything, she becomes more familiar. Not bad, exactly, just more predictable. That is the constant tension in Divergent. The character wants to be complex, but the genre keeps pulling her toward a formula. Still, Triss works because her core conflict is clear. She's trying to survive a system that wants her to be simple. And every step of her journey pushes against that. She leaves abnegation, but does not stop being selfless. She joins Dauntless, but does not become heartless. She learns to fight, but does not lose her fear. She becomes stronger, but not less human. That is the part of the character the movie gets right. Triss is not compelling because she is the most powerful person in the room. She is compelling because she is still becoming herself. She is making choices before she fully understands the cost. She is trying to look brave while carrying fear. She is trying to belong somewhere without surrendering the parts of herself that do not fit. And that is a very human kind of story. So even when Divergent becomes too familiar, too long, or too focused on setting up a franchise, Triss gives the movie an emotional line to follow. She is the reason the faction system matters. She is the reason the training has stakes. She is the reason the idea of being divergent feels personal instead of abstract. Without her, the movie would just be a world with rules. With her, it becomes a story about a young woman slowly realizing that the thing making her dangerous to the system might also be the thing that makes her whole. The word divergent is the whole selling point of the movie, but what makes it interesting is that it is not really treated like a superpower. At least not in the usual sense. Triss does not find out she can fly. She does not suddenly have some glowing ability. She does not become dangerous because she is stronger than everyone else. She becomes dangerous because the system cannot explain her. That is the part of the idea that actually works. In this world, control depends on categories. Everyone has a place. Everyone has a label. Everyone is supposed to belong to one faction, follow one set of values, and become one predictable kind of person. If you are abnegation, you are selfless. If you are dauntless, you are brave. If you are erudite, you are intelligent. The society runs on the belief that people can be understood, sorted, and managed. Then Triss comes along, and the test basically says, no, she is not that simple. That is why divergents are feared. Not because they are automatically violent, not because they are trying to destroy the city, not even because they fully understand what they are. They are feared because their existence proves the system is built on a lie. If one person can belong to more than one category, then maybe the categories were never natural in the first place. And that is a pretty strong idea for a young adult story, because being a teenager often feels exactly like that. People want to define you before you are finished becoming yourself. Parents, schools, friends, society, everyone has some version of who they think you are. The smart one, the quiet one, the difficult one, the brave one, the selfish one, the good one, the strange one. And sometimes, once people give you that label, they expect you to live inside it. Divergent takes that feeling and makes it literal. In this world, being more than one thing is not normal. It is dangerous, it is something to hide. That makes Triss' identity feel less like a gift at first and more like a threat hanging over her. She does not celebrate being divergent when she discovers it. She is warned. She is told to keep quiet. She is told that if the wrong people find out, she could be killed. That changes the whole tone of her journey. This is not just a story about discovering you are special. It is also a story about discovering that being yourself might put you in danger. And that is much more interesting than the usual chosen one setup, because Triss does not fully understand what being divergent means. She only understands that she must hide it. So every test, every training exercise, every moment where she performs too well or reacts too differently becomes risky. She cannot simply try to win. She has to survive without revealing the truth. That gives the movie some of its better tension. The fear simulations especially show why divergence matters. The system expects people to respond in certain ways. It expects fear to follow rules. It expects the mind to be controllable. But Triss does not move through those tests like everyone else. Her mind resists the pattern. She adapts. She breaks through. She does not behave the way the system wants her to behave. And that is the real threat. A society can control people more easily when their reactions are predictable. But if someone can think outside the assigned pattern, they become harder to manipulate. That is what scares G9 and the people protecting the system. Divergents are not just different personalities. They are independent wills. The movie is very clear about that, maybe even too clear at times, but the idea still lands. Divergence means complexity. It means contradiction. It means a person cannot be reduced to one useful function. And in this world, complexity is rebellion. That is where the film's political side comes in. The faction system does not only organize people, it simplifies them. It makes society easier to control by convincing people that they are one thing and should remain that one thing forever. Divergents challenge that because they suggest a more uncomfortable truth. People are not tools. They are not categories. They are not single virtues wearing human faces. They are mixed. They chain. They contain things that do not always match. That is why Triss becomes such a problem. She is not trying to lead a revolution at the start. She is not entering Dauntless with a plan to overthrow anyone. She is just trying to live. But even that is threatening, because her existence alone breaks the rules. I actually think that is one of the better emotional ideas in the movie. The system is not only afraid of what Triss does, it is afraid of what she is. Or more accurately, what she reveals. She reveals that the clean structure everyone lives under is artificial. And once people see that, the whole system becomes weaker. The film does not always explore this as deeply as it could. Sometimes Divergence becomes more of a plot device than a theme. It becomes the secret identity, the reason Triss is hunted, the thing that makes her important to the franchise. But underneath that, there is still a strong metaphor. Being divergent means refusing to become smaller so society can understand you. That is the heart of it, and that is why the idea connects with the movie's target audience. Teenagers are constantly being measured. Grades, groups, expectations, personality labels, family pressure, social pressure. The fear is not just failure. The fear is being trapped in the wrong version of yourself. So a story about a girl who cannot be boxed in naturally has appeal. Even if the world building is shaky, that emotion is real. The irony, of course, is that almost everyone in real life would probably be divergent by this movie's standards. Most people are not only one thing. Most people have different sides depending on where they are, who they are with, and what they are facing. So the idea that divergents are rare can feel strange if you think about it too literally. But as a metaphor, it still works. The rarity is not the point. The fear is the point. The system wants divergence to be rare because it cannot survive if everyone realizes they are more complicated than their faction. The danger is not that a few people are different. The danger is that everyone might be. That is the idea Divergent almost gets to, and when it does, the movie becomes more interesting than its formula suggests. Because Triss' real power is not that she belongs nowhere. It is that she belongs to more than one part of herself. What makes Triss' dauntless training interesting is not just that it is hard. It is that she has to survive it in the most impossible way possible. Most of the other recruits have one clear goal: do well enough to stay. Fight harder, climb higher, jump faster, prove you belong. If they fail, they become factionless, which basically means losing their future. That is already terrifying enough. But Triss has a second problem. If she does too badly, she fails. If she does too well, she exposes herself. That is the trap. She cannot simply train like everyone else. She cannot just push herself to the top and celebrate. Because every time she reacts differently, every time she solves something too quickly, every time she survives a test in a way that does not look normal, she risks revealing that she is divergent. And in this world, being divergent is not just unusual. It is dangerous. It is something people get hunted for. So her entire training arc has this quiet tension underneath it. On the surface, it looks like a typical underdog story. Triss enters Dauntless weaker than most of the others. She is smaller, less experienced, and not naturally built for that violent environment. She has to fight people who are stronger than her. She has to take risks that feel insane. She has to keep moving even when the faction seems almost designed to break her. But underneath all that, she is also performing normality. That is the part that gives her situation more pressure. She is not only learning how to be brave, she is learning how to hide the exact kind of bravery that makes her different. There is something very uncomfortable about that. She has finally left abnegation, the place where she felt restricted, and joined the faction she was always drawn to. You would think Dauntless would be the place where she could become more herself. Instead, it becomes another kind of cage. A louder one, a more violent one, but still a cage, because even in Dauntless, freedom has rules. You can be brave, but only in the accepted way. You can be strong, but not suspiciously strong. You can overcome fear, but not by thinking outside the pattern. You can belong, but only if you belong correctly. That is a really sharp idea. The movie does not always slow down enough to fully explore it, but it is there in the background of almost every training scene. Triss is constantly measuring herself. She has to know when to push and when to pull back. She has to appear like she is improving through effort, not revealing something the system cannot explain. And that makes the Dauntless ranking system feel crueler, because for everyone else, the scoreboard is stressful. For Triss, it is dangerous in both directions. Low ranking means exile. High ranking means attention. She is caught between invisibility and survival, and neither option is safe for long. That is why the fear simulations matter so much. They are not just cool psychological tests. They are the place where Triss' secret becomes hardest to hide. In physical fights, she can lose or win in ways people understand. But inside the fear landscapes, her mind works differently. She can recognize the artificial nature of the test. She can adapt. She can escape the fear instead of just enduring it. To Dauntless, that looks impressive. To the people watching closely, it looks dangerous. And you can feel Triss slowly realizing that being good at this might be the thing that gets her killed. That is a great contradiction for a character to face. The skills she needs to survive are the same skills that might expose her. It also makes her relationship with Four more important. He becomes one of the few people who understands that she cannot simply perform at full strength without consequence. He does not just train her to win. He trains her to survive being watched. That changes the mentor dynamic. He is not only teaching her how to fight or pass tests, he is teaching her how to disguise herself inside a system that is looking for people like her. That is where the movie gets some real tension, because Triss' danger is not always loud. It is not only bullets, punches, or people falling from ledges. Sometimes the danger is someone noticing too much. Someone asking the wrong question. Someone realizing that she should not have been able to do what she just did. For a film that sometimes struggles with suspense, this idea is one of its better built-in sources of pressure. The double danger also makes Triss more sympathetic. She's not just trying to become stronger because the story needs a training arc. She's trying to stay alive without becoming visible in the wrong way. Every success costs her something. Every failure threatens her. Even progress is risky. That is a much more interesting version of the underdog formula. Usually in these stories, the audience wants the hero to rise quickly. We want them to win the fight, climb the ranking, prove everyone wrong. But with Triss, part of you wants her to improve, and another part of you worries when she improves too much. That creates a strange tension in how we watch her. Victory does not feel completely safe, and that fits the larger theme of the movie. The system does not only punish weakness, it also punishes the wrong kind of strength. That is what makes it oppressive. If Triss were only afraid of failing, the story would be simpler. If she were only afraid of being discovered, it would still work. But combining both dangers gives her dauntless journey a stronger shape. She is trapped in a place where she must become brave enough to survive, but careful enough not to reveal why she is capable of surviving. That is a good character conflict. The film could have pushed this even further. It could have spent more time showing the psychological exhaustion of constantly hiding. It could have made every test feel more dangerous because of what it might reveal. It could have turned the training section into a tighter game of survival, where Triss is not just competing against other recruits, but also managing her own visibility. Still, even as it is, the idea works. Triss' time in Dauntless is not just about learning to fight. It is about learning the cost of being different in a world that watches difference like a crime. She has to become stronger, but not too obviously. She has to belong, but not completely. She has to hide, but not disappear. And that is what makes her situation feel so tense. For Triss, Dauntless is not only a faction. It is a test she has to pass without letting anyone know what the real answer is. The Dauntless training section is where Divergent really becomes the movie most people remember. Not the politics, not the speeches about factions, not even the big conspiracy at first. It is the training, the jumping onto moving trains, the fights, the rankings, the fear tests, the whole reckless culture of people proving bravery by throwing themselves into danger every 5 minutes. And depending on how much patience you have for this kind of thing, this is either where the movie gets exciting or where it starts to drag, because the training is a huge part of the film. Once Triss chooses Dauntless, the story settles into this long initiation process where she has to prove she belongs. She is no longer in the quiet, controlled world of abnegation. She has entered a faction that seems to treat danger like a daily routine. Nobody walks calmly into Dauntless. They run, they jump, they climb, they shout, they fight. Everything is physical, public, and a little ridiculous if you think about it too long. But at first it works. There is energy in it. Triss stepping into Dauntless feels like she has entered another movie. The color, the noise, the movement, the attitude, it is all completely different from where she came from. Abnegation asked her to disappear. Dauntless demands that she be seen, judged, tested, and ranked. That contrast gives the training section a strong start. The initiation is not just about learning to fight. It is about learning how this faction thinks. Dauntless is supposed to value courage, but the version of courage we see is harsh and almost performative. You are brave if you jump first, brave if you take the hit, brave if you do not hesitate, brave if you can turn fear into a show for everyone watching. There is something exciting about that, but also something kind of ugly, and that ugliness is important. The training scenes slowly reveal that Dauntless is not simply a cool faction full of fearless protectors. It is a system that breaks people down. New recruits are pushed into violence, humiliation, and competition. Their worth is constantly measured. Their future depends on rankings. If they fail, they do not just lose pride, they lose their place in society. That gives the training real stakes. Every fight matters because failure has consequences. Every test matters because someone is always watching. Triss is not just trying to become stronger for personal growth. She's trying to avoid being erased from the system completely. That makes even the more familiar training scenes feel heavier than they might have otherwise. Still, the movie definitely tests your patience here. There is a lot of training, a lot, punching, running, jumping, climbing, facing fears, getting ranked. Getting warned, getting knocked down, getting back up. After a while you can feel the repetition. The movie keeps returning to the same basic rhythm. Triss struggles, Triss gets hurt, Triss learns, Triss improves, Triss becomes more noticeable. That structure is clear, but it also becomes predictable. The film spends so much time on the initiation that the larger story almost waits in the background. The erudite threat is there. The danger of being divergent is there. The politics are there, but for a long stretch, Divergent is basically a training movie with dystopian decoration around it. Now, to be fair, some of that training is necessary. We need to see Triss earn her place. If she walked into Dauntless and instantly became powerful, the whole arc would feel fake. The movie is smarter than that. It lets her struggle. It lets her lose. It lets her look physically outmatched. That makes her improvement more satisfying. And this is one of the areas where Shailene Woodley helps the film a lot. She does not play Triss like someone secretly waiting to become perfect. She plays her like someone who is scared, embarrassed, angry, and stubborn all at once. When Triss gets knocked down, you feel the humiliation. When she gets back up, you feel the effort. That matters because the training section would be much weaker if the lead performance did not sell the pain behind it. The fear simulations are probably the most interesting part of the initiation because they move beyond simple physical survival. Fighting is one thing, jumping from a train is one thing, but fear tests go inside the character. They make bravery psychological instead of just athletic. That is where the movie finds a better use for the dauntless concept. Courage is not only about taking punches, it is about facing what your mind creates when nobody else can save you. These sequences give Triss training a more personal edge, especially because her divergence changes the way she responds to them. Those scenes are also important because they separate Triss from the other recruits. In the physical stage, she can look like an underdog. In the fear stage, you start to see why she is different. Her mind does not simply obey the simulation. She can recognize it, bend it, escape it. That makes the training more than just a competition. It becomes a danger zone for her secret. The problem is that the movie does not always build enough suspense around these moments. Some tests should feel terrifying, but they pass too quickly. Some challenges should leave more emotional damage, but the film moves on. The initiation is dangerous, but the storytelling sometimes treats danger like another stage in the program. That is where the training section becomes uneven. At its best, it is exciting and character-driven. At its weakest, it feels stretched and repetitive. You understand why the scenes are there, but you also start thinking a tighter version of the movie could have made the same points with fewer rounds of testing. And then there is the dauntless lifestyle itself, which can be both cool and unintentionally funny. The constant running and jumping has a certain visual energy, but after a while you do start wondering if these people know they can just walk sometimes. Every entrance has to be extreme. Every movement has to prove bravery. It is entertaining, sure, but it can also look like a faction built entirely around parkour, tattoos, and bad decisions. That does not ruin the movie, but it does make the world feel a little silly at points. Still, the training does give Divergent its strongest sense of momentum. Without it, the first half of the film would mostly be exposition. The initiation gives the story a physical shape. Triss starts at the bottom, faces pressure, learns the rules, discovers the cruelty of the faction, and slowly becomes someone who can survive inside it. That progression is simple but effective. It also gives the audience something easy to follow. Even if the politics of the world feel underexplained, the training stakes are clear. Do well or lose everything. Hide your difference or get exposed. Trust the wrong person and you may not survive. That is clean drama. The dauntless initiation also shows the difference between what a faction claims to be and what it actually becomes. On paper, dauntless is bravery. In practice, it often looks like aggression. On paper, it protects society. In practice, it trains young people to obey violence. That contradiction becomes important later because it explains how dauntless can be manipulated into serving a darker purpose. So the training is not just filler, even when it feels overextended. It is teaching us how this faction can be used. A group that values courage without compassion can be turned into a weapon. A group trained to obey strength can be redirected by power. a group that teaches young people to ignore fear, can also teach them to ignore conscience. That is one of the more interesting things hiding inside the training arc. The movie does not always say it directly, but you can see it. Dauntless is being prepared for something. The cruelty of initiation is not separate from the larger conspiracy. It is part of the same culture that makes the faction vulnerable to control. So yes, the Dauntless training section is too long. It repeats itself. Some scenes could have been cut. Some challenges needed more emotional weight. But it is also the section that gives Divergent much of its identity. It is where Triss changes. It is where the world becomes physical. It is where the movie's ideas about fear, conformity, and survival stop being abstract. And maybe that is why people remember it, because even with all its flaws, watching Triss fight her way through Dauntless gives the film a pulse. It turns her internal conflict into something visible. Every bruise, every jump, every failed fight, every fear simulation becomes part of the same question. Can she survive this world without letting it decide who she is? The more time we spend inside Dauntless, the more obvious it becomes that this faction has a serious identity problem. On paper, Dauntless is supposed to represent bravery. They are the protectors of the city, the guards, the fighters, the people who run toward danger when everyone else steps back. That sounds noble enough. Every society needs people willing to defend it, but the Dauntless we actually see in the movie does not always feel noble. A lot of the time, it feels like bravery has been confused with cruelty. And that is where the faction becomes more interesting than it first appears. Because when Triss first looks at Dauntless from the outside, they seem exciting. They are loud, fast, fearless, alive in a way abnegation never allowed her to be. They jump from trains, climb buildings, laugh in the face of danger, and move through the city like rules do not apply to them. For someone raised in a faction built on restraint, that kind of freedom would be intoxicating. You can understand why she is drawn to them, but once she enters that world, the fantasy starts to crack. Dauntless is not just freedom, it is pressure, it is competition, it is public failure. It is violence treated like a personality test. Every recruit is forced to prove themselves, not in a healthy or disciplined way, but in an environment where fear is mocked, weakness is punished, and survival depends on how much pain you can absorb without breaking. That is not courage in its purest form. That is a culture turning courage into performance. And there is a difference. Real bravery can be quiet, it can be moral, it can be emotional. It can mean protecting someone, admitting the truth, refusing an order, or standing alone when everyone else follows. But Dauntless has reduced bravery to spectacle. Jump first, hit harder, do not flinch, do not cry. Do not question, just prove again and again that you are not afraid. And the strange thing is, that version of bravery makes them easier to control. Because once courage becomes about obedience to toughness, the faction loses the ability to think for itself. The recruits are trained to ignore hesitation, but hesitation is not always weakness. Sometimes hesitation is conscience. Sometimes fear is the mind telling you that something is wrong. If you train people to crush every doubt, you can also train them to follow terrible orders without stopping to ask why. That is what makes Dauntless dangerous. Not just dangerous to enemies, dangerous to itself. The initiation process shows this clearly. The recruits are ranked, humiliated, threatened with becoming factionless, and pushed into violence against each other. They are told this is how they become brave, but what we are really watching is a system breaking down individuality and replacing it with aggression. If you survive, you become harder. If you fail, you disappear. That kind of system does not produce protectors. It produces weapons, and that is exactly why Dauntless can later be used by Erudite. The faction has already been prepared for manipulation. It values strength, speed, obedience, and fearlessness, but not reflection, not compassion, not moral judgment. So when someone finds a way to aim that force in a political direction, the faction becomes terrifyingly useful. This is one of the smarter ideas in Divergent, even if the movie does not always dig into it as deeply as it could. The corruption of Dauntless is not sudden. It is already there in the training. It is there in the way people are treated. It is there in the way instructors enjoy power. It is there in the way failure becomes a social death sentence. The final act does not come out of nowhere. It grows out of a culture that has already started mistaking brutality for strength. That is why Triss' experience in Dauntless matters so much. She does not simply learn how to fight. She learns what kind of bravery she does not want to become. She is attracted to Dauntless because it seems free, but she slowly discovers that this freedom has its own prison. In Abnegation, she was expected to erase herself through selflessness. In Dauntless, she is expected to erase herself through toughness. Different costume, same problem. Both systems want one version of her, and Triss cannot live that way. That is what makes her presence inside Dauntless quietly disruptive. She is not the biggest fighter. She is not the most naturally aggressive. She is not someone who enjoys cruelty for its own sake. She has fear. She has empathy. She has hesitation, and the faction treats those things like weaknesses, even though they may be the very qualities that keep her human. The movie becomes more compelling when you look at it that way. Triss is not only trying to survive dauntless training, she's trying to survive dauntless ideology. She has to become stronger without becoming cruel. She has to learn courage without losing compassion. She has to pass through a violent system without letting that system define her completely. That is a stronger conflict than just girl learns to fight, and it also makes some of the dauntless characters more uncomfortable. The aggressive trainers and recruits are not just bullies in a generic teen movie sense. They are symptoms of the faction's values pushed too far. They show what happens when a society rewards hardness more than humanity. Of course, the film sometimes handles this in a blunt way. Some characters are just mean because the story needs obstacles. Some scenes lean into obvious villain behavior. Not every moment is subtle, but the larger idea still works. Dauntless is supposed to be the brave faction, yet it often looks afraid of vulnerability, afraid of softness, afraid of doubt, afraid of anything that might make a person harder to command. And that is ironic, because a faction built around bravery should be the first to question injustice. The brave should be the ones who stand up when the system becomes corrupt. But in Divergent, Dauntless is so focused on physical courage that it loses moral courage. It can jump from trains, but it cannot always stop itself from becoming a tool. That is a great contradiction. It also makes the faction more tragic. There is something powerful inside Dauntless. The energy, the boldness, the refusal to live timidly, those things are not automatically bad. Triss is drawn to them for a reason. The problem is that the faction has taken something valuable and twisted it into a hierarchy of pain. Bravery becomes dominance, training becomes abuse, protection becomes militarization, and belonging becomes conditional on how much of yourself you are willing to destroy. That is why Dauntless is more than just the cool action faction. It is the movie's clearest example of how a virtue can become dangerous when it is isolated from every other human quality. Bravery without kindness becomes cruelty. Bravery without intelligence becomes recklessness. Bravery without honesty becomes blind obedience. Bravery without selflessness becomes ego. The faction system claims that separating virtues creates order, but Dauntless shows the flaw in that thinking. A single virtue, cut away from the rest, does not stay pure. It becomes distorted. And Triss, because she is divergent, can see that. Maybe not perfectly at first, but instinctively. She knows bravery is not enough by itself. She carries pieces of other factions inside her, and that is exactly what allows her to resist becoming just another product of dauntless culture. So when we watch her inside this faction, the real question is not only whether she can become brave, it is whether she can remain whole in a place that keeps mistaking cruelty for courage. This is probably where Divergent loses the most people, not because the story is impossible to follow. It is actually very easy to follow, maybe too easy sometimes. The problem is that the movie takes a long time to get where it is going, and you can feel that length sitting on the film. At around 2 hours and 20 minutes, Divergent is a big movie for a story that, honestly, does not always need to be that big. The beginning works well enough. We are introduced to the factions, Triss family, the aptitude test, the choosing ceremony, and the idea that being divergent is dangerous. That part has momentum because everything is new. The world is being explained, Triss is making a life-changing decision, and the audience is still curious about how this society functions. Then she joins Dauntless, and the movie settles into training mode, and it stays there. For a long while, now I do not think the training section is useless. It is not filler in the most basic sense. Triss needs to struggle. She needs to be tested. She needs to earn her place in Dauntless, and we need to see how brutal this faction really is. If the movie skipped over that, her transformation would feel fake, but the film keeps circling the same kind of beat. Triss gets challenged. Triss fails or nearly fails. Someone doubts her. 4 gives her guidance. She pushes harder. The ranking system threatens her. Another test comes. Another warning comes. Another moment reminds us that she has to hide being divergent. Individually, many of these scenes are fine. Together, they start to feel heavy. You can tell the movie is trying to do several things at once. It wants to introduce a whole dystopian world. It wants to develop Triss. It wants to build the romance with 4. It wants to show dauntless training in detail. It wants to hint at Erudite's political plan. It wants to set up side characters. It wants to create enough mythology for sequels. That is a lot of weight for one movie to carry. And sometimes, instead of moving like a thriller, Divergent moves like a checklist. We need the test. We need the ceremony. We need the arrival at Dauntless. We need the first fight. We need the rankings. We need the fear simulation. We need the romantic tension. We need the villain setup. We need the final rebellion. The pieces are all there, but the rhythm is not always sharp. That is why the middle section can feel samey. The locations do not change enough. The situations repeat. The emotional stakes are clear, but the movie keeps expressing them in similar ways. After a while, you are not surprised by the next challenge. You are just waiting for the larger plot to properly wake up. And when it finally does, it is almost strange how late the main conflict arrives. The erudite conspiracy is obviously important. Jinen's plan is the real threat behind the story. Dauntless being turned into a weapon is the thing that pushes the film into its final act. But for so much of the runtime, that plot feels like it is waiting off to the side while Triss completes another stage of initiation. By the time the movie shifts into full action and political danger, you may feel two things at once: relief that the story is finally accelerating, and frustration that it took this long to get there. That is not a great combination. A tighter edit could have helped a lot. Not a completely different movie, just a sharper one. 15 or 20 minutes removed from the training repetition, a little more focus on the conspiracy earlier, maybe stronger suspense around Triss being discovered. That could have made the film feel more urgent. Because the raw material is not bad, the structure just stretches it too thin. There is also a difference between slow pacing and patient storytelling. Slow pacing can work beautifully when every scene deepens the characters or the world. But in Divergent, some scenes repeat information we already understand. We already know Triss is in danger. We already know Dauntless is harsh. We already know she must hide her identity. We already know 4 is mysterious and important. The movie keeps reminding us instead of escalating those ideas. That is why some viewers find it boring even while admitting it is well made. It looks polished. The actors are trying. The premise has a hook, but the storytelling does not always have enough variation to keep the length feeling justified. Still, I can understand why the movie is paced this way. It is adapting a popular book. It wants to satisfy fans who expect certain moments to appear. It wants to build the world carefully enough for viewers who have not read the novel. It also wants Triss improvement to feel gradual instead of rushed. Those are reasonable goals. The issue is balance. A movie version cannot always carry the same structure as a book. What feels immersive on the page can feel stretched on screen. A training chapter in a novel can explore inner thoughts, small details, and emotional shifts. In a film, repeated training scenes can start to look like variations of the same sequence unless the direction makes each one feel distinct. And Divergent does not always manage that. The film is strongest when the pacing is connected to Triss' inner pressure. When she is afraid of being exposed, when she is caught between failure and suspicion, when the fear simulations reveal something dangerous about her mind, those moments have tension. They feel like they are moving the story forward. But when the movie becomes just another round of physical trial, ranking pressure, or dauntless attitude, the pace slows down. The final act has the opposite problem. Once the conspiracy fully activates, the movie suddenly has a lot to resolve. Dauntless, erudite, abnegation, Triss family, 4's role, Jinen's control, Divergence being hunted, all of it rushes into focus. The film becomes more exciting, but also more crowded. It is as if the movie spent so much time preparing that it has to hurry through some of the emotional consequences. That unevenness is what makes the structure feel off. The first half stretches, the ending compresses, the middle repeats, the final act wakes up, and yet the movie is not completely dead during those slower stretches. Shailene Woodley keeps Triss watchable. The faction system remains interesting enough to carry some curiosity. The dauntless setting gives the film physical energy. If you are already invested in the world, the length may not bother you much. But if you are not, you feel every extra scene. That is the danger with a franchise starter. It has to be a satisfying movie by itself, not just a long introduction to later chapters. Divergent sometimes forgets that. It spends so much time establishing the world that the actual story occasionally feels delayed. And that is frustrating because the movie has a strong enough concept to move faster. A girl discovers she is dangerous to the system, hides inside a violent faction, and uncovers a political takeover. That is a tense premise. That should have a sharper pulse. Instead, the film often chooses length over urgency. So when people call Divergent overlong, I understand it. The issue is not simply the runtime. Long movies can fly by when the pacing is alive. The issue is that the film does not always earn its length. Too many sections feel stretched, and too many important developments arrive later than they should. The result is a movie that has momentum in pieces, but not always as a whole. It starts with a strong hook, slows down inside Dauntless, builds some decent character tension, then finally becomes the rebellion story it was clearly heading toward from the beginning. For some viewers, that journey is satisfying. For others, it feels like waiting too long for the movie to become itself, and that may be the simplest way to put it. Divergent is not lacking story. It is just carrying its story in a bag that is a little too heavy. The strange thing about Divergent is that the story has plenty of situations that should be suspenseful: a secret identity, a dangerous test, a faction where failure can ruin your life, a government conspiracy, a heroine who has to hide what she really is. On paper, that is strong material. You can easily imagine a tighter version of this movie, where every scene feels like Triss is one mistake away from being exposed. But the film does not always build that pressure properly. It has tension in the idea, but not always in the execution. Take the aptitude test, for example. This should be one of the most nerve-wracking scenes in the whole movie. It is the moment where Triss discovers she is not like everyone else. It is the moment that changes the way she sees herself. It is also the first real warning that this society is more dangerous than it looks. And the scene works to a point. There is mystery there is fear. Maggie Q's character gives the warning enough seriousness that we understand Triss is in trouble, but the movie moves through it quickly, maybe too quickly. It tells us the result is dangerous, but it does not really let the dread build. We do not get enough time to feel the weight of what is happening before the story is already pushing us toward the choosing ceremony. The film wants the reveal to matter, and it does matter, but it could have hit harder if the scene had more anticipation. That becomes a pattern. The dauntless trials should also feel more suspenseful than they often do. These are tests that can decide whether someone belongs or becomes factionless. They are physical, psychological, and sometimes life-threatening. But a lot of the time, the movie treats them like stages in a training montage rather than moments where the audience should be holding its breath. Triss enters a challenge, she struggles, she survives, the story moves forward. That rhythm is clear, but after a while it becomes easy to predict, and predictability is one of the film's biggest problems. Not because every movie needs shocking twists. A story can be predictable and still powerful if the emotions are strong enough, but Divergent often behaves like its revelations are more surprising than they actually are. You can feel where the movie is heading long before it arrives. The faction system is obviously broken. Erudite is obviously not just a group of harmless intellectuals. G9 is obviously dangerous. 4 is obviously more important than he first appears. Triss, Divergence is obviously going to make her central to the conflict. The romance is obviously going to grow. The training is obviously preparing her for something bigger. None of this ruins the movie completely, but it does make the suspense weaker. Because suspense is not only about danger, it is about uncertainty. It is about not knowing exactly how a situation will unfold. With Divergent, you often know the direction of a scene before the scene fully plays out. The movie still has motion, but not enough surprise. 4's mystery is a good example. The film presents him as guarded and unreadable, a mentor with secrets. And Theo James plays that cool distance well, but the story around him is not especially hard to decode. You can tell early on that he is not simply a harsh trainer. You can tell he is going to become emotionally important to Triss. You can tell his past will matter. So when the movie starts revealing more about him, it is interesting for the character, but not exactly shocking. The same thing happens with Triss' family connections and the larger conspiracy. The film drops hints, but the hints are not subtle enough to create real mystery. Instead of feeling like we are uncovering a hidden truth, it sometimes feels like we are waiting for the characters to catch up with what the audience already suspects. The dauntless material gives the film most of its action identity. These people do not simply walk into a room. They leap, run, climb, fight, and throw themselves into danger like the entire faction is allergic to normal movement. At first, that gives the movie a fun burst of energy. Triss leaving the quiet world of abnegation and entering this reckless, aggressive culture creates a strong contrast. Dauntless feels alive, maybe stupidly alive sometimes, but alive. And that works for the story because Triss is supposed to feel overwhelmed. She has entered a place where fear is not private anymore. Fear is public. Everyone can see it. Everyone can judge it. Every physical challenge becomes a way of asking, do you belong here or not? That gives the action a personal function. The fights are not just there because the movie needs punching. They are tied to Triss' survival. If she cannot fight well enough, she falls in the rankings. If she falls too far, she becomes factionless. So even a basic training fight has stakes beyond winning or losing. That is where the action works best. When it is connected to Triss' vulnerability, because she is not introduced as a natural fighter, she gets hurt, she loses. She looks small in a space designed for people who are louder and more physically confident than her. That makes some of the early combat more engaging than it would be if she were instantly amazing. You can feel the effort. You can feel the embarrassment. You can feel her trying to force her body to catch up with the choice she made. The problem is that after a while, the physical action starts to repeat itself. Training fight, ranking pressure, jumping challenge, more training, more danger, more proof that Dauntless is harsh. The movie keeps moving, but movement is not the same as escalation. A strong action film makes each sequence feel different from the last. Each one should reveal something new, raise the stakes, or change the character's position. Here, some sequences do that. Others just remind us of things we already know. We already know Dauntless is intense. We already know Triss is struggling. We already know failure is dangerous. So when the film gives us another physical challenge without adding a fresh emotional turn, the action begins to feel more like routine than suspense. The fear simulations are more interesting because they change the texture of the action. Instead of just throwing punches or jumping across gaps, Triss has to face psychological danger. These scenes are more abstract, more internal, and more connected to the idea of divergence. They let the movie step outside ordinary combat and show that bravery is not only about physical toughness. That is important, because if all Dauntless action were just fighting and stunts, the movie would become one note very quickly. The fear landscapes allow the film to explore Triss' mind, her instincts, and the way she solves problems differently from everyone else. They also create one of the few types of action where being too good becomes dangerous for her. In a normal action movie, the hero escaping quickly is a victory. For Triss, it can be evidence. That gives those scenes an extra layer. She is not just surviving the simulation. She's trying not to survive in a way that exposes who she really is. That is a clever tension, and the movie is at its best when it remembers that. Still, even the fear simulations could have been stronger. Some of them look interesting, but they do not always feel as frightening as they should. The concept is scarier than the execution. Being trapped inside your own fear while people study your reactions should feel deeply uncomfortable. It should feel invasive, claustrophobic, like Triss has nowhere to hide because even her mind is being watched. Sometimes the film gets close to that, but too often the scenes move through the danger quickly and neatly. They function, but they do not always disturb. The hand-to-hand fights have a similar issue. They are not terrible, they are clear enough, and they serve the training arc, but they rarely feel raw. You do not always feel the full weight of the hits, the bruises, the exhaustion, or the long-term damage. The movie wants Dauntless to feel brutal, but it also wants to remain accessible, polished, and within the boundaries of a young adult blockbuster. That PG-13 restraint is noticeable. The film has violence, but it often feels softened. There is danger, but not enough consequence. People get hurt, but the camera does not always stay long enough for the pain to matter. Characters die, but the emotional impact is sometimes lighter than the situation demands. The action is meant to be intense, yet the presentation can feel too clean for the world it is describing. That does not mean the movie needed to become graphic or cruel just for shock value. But if a story is about a violent faction training teenagers into weapons, the action should carry more physical and emotional cost. You should feel that this world is damaging people. Sometimes you do, not always. The final act gives the movie its biggest action shift. By that point, the training is over, and Dauntless is no longer just a harsh faction. It becomes part of the larger political threat. The action moves from personal survival to social violence. That is when the earlier training material starts to pay off, because we understand how a faction built on aggression and obedience could be turned into a tool. That idea is stronger than some of the action itself. The image of Dauntless being manipulated into attacking abnegation is more disturbing conceptually than it is spectacular visually. Dauntless also has more potential than the film fully explores. At first, it looks exciting, then it looks cruel, then it becomes a weapon. That progression is actually strong. But the movie could have pushed harder into how bravery becomes corrupted. How do you take a virtue like courage and slowly turn it into obedience? How does a protector class become a military tool? How does a culture of fearlessness become a culture of not questioning orders? The film shows pieces of this, especially through training, but it often treats Dauntless more like an action environment than a psychological machine. And that is a missed chance, because Dauntless could have been terrifying, not just because people get hurt there, but because the whole faction teaches young people to confuse toughness with morality. That is a much sharper idea than simply watching recruits fight and climb and jump from trains. The movie gets close to it, then it moves on. Even Triss' own journey has areas that could have gone deeper. Her conflict is strong. She leaves abnegation, joins Dauntless, hides being divergent, and slowly realizes the system is more dangerous than she thought. That works, but the film sometimes pushes her into the familiar chosen heroine lane too quickly. The more interesting Triss is not the special girl who can change everything. The more interesting Triss is the confused girl who does not know where she belongs. That version of her is more human, more vulnerable, more emotionally specific. She's torn between loyalty to her family and hunger for freedom. She wants to be brave, but she is scared. She wants to belong, but belonging keeps asking her to become less complicated than she is. That is great character material. The movie uses it, but it could have let it breathe more. Instead, the film spends a lot of time on training mechanics, and not enough time on the emotional cost of transformation. What does it do to Triss to leave a culture of selflessness and enter a culture of violence? What parts of abnegation does she miss? What parts of Dauntless disappoint her? When does bravery start feeling like freedom, and when does it start feeling like another prison? Those questions are in the story. They are just not always explored with the depth they deserve. The romance with Four is another area where the movie chooses a safer path. Their relationship is not bad. The chemistry is there. The trust between them makes sense. But the film sometimes leans into the expected YA romantic beats when it could be spending more time on the larger identity conflict. That does not mean the romance should disappear completely. It means the romance should sharpen the theme, not distract from it. At its best, Triss and Four work because they both hide parts of themselves inside Dauntless. They both understand fear. They both know the faction's version of bravery is incomplete. That is interesting. But when the relationship becomes too much about the familiar guarded boy softens for the heroine pattern, the movie loses some of its edge. There was room for something more specific there, something less polished. Something more tied to two people surviving a system that punishes vulnerability. The violence also needed more consequence. This has come up before, but it is one of the film's biggest missed opportunities. Dauntless training should leave marks. The fear tests should feel invasive. Death should echo. Becoming factionless should feel like a genuine social horror. The movie has all of these elements, but it often keeps them just clean enough to remain comfortable. That comfort weakens the dystopia. A world like this should not feel too easy to watch. Not all the time, at least. There should be moments that make you uncomfortable with why Dauntless looks cool. Moments that make you question why the audience is enjoying the same violence the system uses to shape people. Moments that show the cost of turning teenagers into weapons. The film has danger. It needed more aftermath. That is the difference. Even the visual design has missed potential. The ruined Chicago setting is strong. The city has mood. The overgrown spaces, the damaged buildings, the drained lake, those images give the world texture. But the faction identities are not as visually rich as they could be. A society built around identity should look more shaped by identity. Every faction should feel like a culture, not just a costume choice, not just a color palette. A culture, the architecture, rituals, daily behavior, body language, food, public spaces, family life, all of that could have shown us how deeply the faction system controls people. Instead, the movie gives us a readable world, but not always a fully lived-in one. Readable is useful, lived-in is powerful, and Divergent needed more of the second. The suspense also had more room to grow. Triss Double Danger is one of the best ideas in the movie. Fail and become factionless, succeed too much and reveal you are divergent. That should make almost every Dauntless scene tense. Every test should feel like a trap. Every victory should carry risk. Every person watching her should feel like a possible threat. Sometimes that works, but not often enough. The movie tells us Triss is in danger, but it does not always make us feel watched with her. It could have been more paranoid, more claustrophobic, more patient with silence, more interested in the fear of being exposed than simply moving to the next training beat. That would have made the middle section feel less repetitive too. Instead of another test, each challenge could have felt like another chance to be discovered. That small shift would have changed the whole rhythm, and that is really the pattern with Divergent. So many of its flaws are not failures of concept. They are failures of emphasis. The movie often has the right idea, but it does not push the idea far enough. The faction system is interesting but underexplored. The factionless are disturbing but underused. G9 is thematically strong but not complex enough. Dauntless is exciting but not frightening enough. The romance has chemistry but feels familiar. The violence has stakes but not enough consequence. The world looks good in places but not distinctive enough overall. Triss works, but her inner conflict could have been richer. That is why the film feels like potential more than achievement. And to be clear, potential is not nothing. A movie with no potential is just empty. Divergent is not empty. It gives you enough to imagine the stronger version, which is exactly why it can be frustrating. You are not bored because there is nothing there. You are frustrated because there is something there, and the movie keeps choosing the safer route. It wants to be a dystopian critique, but also a marketable franchise. It wants to be about individuality, but follows a familiar formula. It wants Dauntless to be dangerous, but also cool. It wants G9 to be politically threatening, but keeps her fairly simple. It wants the world to feel oppressive, but not too uncomfortable. That balancing act is probably why the film worked for some viewers and disappointed others. If you want accessible YA entertainment, the safer choices may not bother you. They may even help. The movie is easy to follow, emotionally clear, and built around a strong hook. But if you want the film to fully explore the darkness of its own premise, it leaves you wanting more, much more. Because Divergent is sitting on a powerful idea, a society that fears people who are whole. That is genuinely interesting. Not people who are violent, not people who are evil, not people who want power, people who are whole. People who contain more than one quality, people who cannot be reduced into a function, people who remind the world that every category is incomplete. That idea deserves a sharper movie, a stranger movie, a more uncomfortable movie. A movie less afraid to question its own coolness. The version we got is watchable, sometimes engaging, sometimes emotionally sincere, but it is also cautious. It takes a bold metaphor and wraps it in familiar young adult packaging. It gives us enough to understand why the story connected, but not enough to make the world unforgettable. So when people talk about Divergent having missed potential, this is what they mean. Not that it should have been a completely different film, just that it should have trusted the strongest parts of itself more. It should have trusted the politics, trusted the discomfort, trusted the loneliness of being different, trusted the ugliness of the system, trusted the idea that a story about refusing categories should not feel so neatly categorized, because somewhere inside Divergent is a much sharper review of control, identity, and conformity. The movie reaches for it, it just does not always grab hard enough. So after all of that, where does Divergent actually land? Honestly, somewhere in the middle. And I know that sounds like a boring answer, but it is probably the most honest one. Divergent is not the disaster some people make it out to be, but it is also not the bold, unforgettable dystopian film it clearly wanted to become. It is a movie with a strong hook, a likable lead, a few genuinely interesting ideas, and enough franchise polish to keep it watchable. But it is also familiar, very familiar. That is the thing you keep coming back to. The movie has its own vocabulary, factions, divergence, dauntless, abnegation, erudite, but the shape of the story is one we have seen before. A young woman discovers she is different, a system fears her, a controlled society begins to reveal its cruelty, a mysterious love interest helps guide her, a villain tries to preserve order through violence. The ending opens the door for a bigger rebellion. None of that is automatically bad, but Divergent does not always make those familiar pieces feel new enough. The best thing about the film is still the central idea. A society that forces people into one identity, and a girl who becomes dangerous because she cannot be reduced to one thing. That is a strong metaphor. It is simple, yes, but it works because it connects to something real. The fear of being labeled, the pressure to choose who you are before you are ready, the loneliness of feeling like you do not fully belong anywhere. That is the emotional heartbeat of the movie. And when the film stays close to Triss, it is much stronger. Shailene Woodley carries a lot of the movie's weight. She makes Triss feel vulnerable without making her weak, brave without making her invincible, special without making her unbearable. That is not a small achievement. In a world that can feel artificial, she gives the story something human to hold on to. Theo James also works well as Four. The character is built from familiar YA ingredients, sure, but James gives him enough control and quiet intensity to make the role effective. Their romance is not the deepest part of the film, and it probably was not needed as much as the genre thinks it was, but it is not empty either. There is enough chemistry there to make the relationship believable within the kind of story Divergent is telling. The supporting cast adds value too, even when the script does not fully use them. Kate Winslet brings authority to G9, Maggie Q adds mystery and warning, Ashley Judd brings warmth to Triss' family side. Zoe Kravitz adds a spark that the movie could have used more of. The cast is not really the problem here. The problem is that the movie often has better ingredients than execution. The faction system is interesting, but not fully believable. The factionless are disturbing, but underexplored. Dauntless is exciting, but overused. G9 is thematically strong, but not as threatening as she should be. The action has energy, but few truly memorable set pieces. The violence has stakes, but not enough consequence. The world looks good in places, especially future Chicago, but it rarely becomes visually unforgettable. And then there is the pacing. That long middle section inside Dauntless is probably where the film loses a lot of viewers. The training matters, but it goes on too long. The story keeps repeating similar beats. Triss struggles, Triss improves, Triss hides her secret, Triss gets warned, Triss faces another test. some of those moments work. Together, they start to weigh the movie down. The final act finally brings the political conflict forward, and when it does, you can feel the movie becoming more urgent. Dauntless being weaponized, Erudite making its move, Divergence becoming crucial, all of that gives the story a stronger shape. But because the film spends so long getting there, the ending also feels slightly rushed emotionally. That is the pattern with Divergent. It often has the right idea, but the wrong emphasis. It knows Triss matters, but sometimes gets distracted by franchise setup. It knows the faction system is the hook, but does not explore the world deeply enough. It knows Dauntless is dangerous, but still wants it to look cool. It knows violence should hurt, but keeps the presentation fairly clean. It knows individuality is the theme, but follows a formula that feels very safe. And that contradiction is hard to ignore. This is a movie about refusing categories that fits very comfortably into a category. It is a story about breaking the system, but you can feel the studio system around it. It wants to be about dangerous difference, but it rarely becomes truly daring as a film. Still, I cannot dismiss it completely, because Divergent does work on a basic emotional level. It gives its audience a clear fantasy. What if the thing that made you feel wrong was actually the thing that made you powerful? That is a strong young adult idea, maybe even the strongest thing in the movie. And for viewers who connect with that, the flaws may not matter as much. You can see why people were drawn to it. The factions are easy to remember. Triss is easy to root for. The romance is simple and accessible. The world has enough mystery to invite curiosity. The training arc gives the movie movement. The soundtrack gives it pulse. The ending promises more. As a franchise opener, it does the basic job. As a standalone film, it is more uneven. That is probably the fairest split. If you are already into young adult dystopian stories, Divergent can be entertaining. It has enough emotion, action, identity drama, and rebellion to satisfy that audience. It is not as sharp as The Hunger Games, not as visually bold as it could be, not as politically deep as its premise suggests, but it is watchable, sometimes more than watchable. But if you are tired of this formula, the movie will probably feel overlong and too familiar. You will see the twists coming. You will question the faction logic. You will wish the world had more detail. You will feel the middle stretch dragging. You will probably spend more time thinking about the stronger version of the movie than the one actually on screen, and that is the frustration. Divergent is not empty. It has a pulse. It has an idea. It has a lead performance that holds it together. It just never fully becomes the film its premise deserves. So my final feeling is this. Divergent is flawed, formulaic, and sometimes too safe, but it is also sincere, watchable, and built around a theme that still connects. It may not escape the shadow of other young adult dystopian films, but it does have its own emotional reason for existing. It is a movie about identity that needed a stronger identity of its own. But even with that weakness, there is something in Triss' journey that still works. The fear of being reduced, the need to belong without disappearing, the discovery that being complicated is not a flaw. Those ideas keep the movie alive, even when the storytelling around them feels familiar. So no, Divergent is not great dystopian cinema, but it is not worthless franchise product either. It sits in that strange space between promise and limitation, strong enough to explain why people cared, weak enough to explain why the series eventually lost momentum, interesting enough to discuss, familiar enough to criticize. And maybe that is the legacy of the first film, not a masterpiece, not a failure, just a movie with one genuinely strong idea, a committed lead performance, and a world that almost became as powerful as it wanted to be.